Hello everyone, I am the Macabre. I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that please like the video and subscribe to the channel. Where are you from and what time are you watching now? Sit back and relax. The car's tires crunched over the gravel road as Eleanor Ellie Carter slowed to a stop at the edge of Black Hollow. The town was hidden deep within the Appalachian Mountains, surrounded by dense forests that seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction. The air was heavy with the scent of pine and damp earth, and the late afternoon sun cast long shadows over the cracked asphalt. Ellie stepped out of her car, her boots sinking slightly into the mud, and looked around. The town was eerily quiet, as if it had been abandoned long ago, but the faint glow of lamplight in some of the windows told her otherwise. Black Hollow was a place frozen in time. The houses were old, their wooden frames warped and weathered, with paint peeling off in long, jagged strips. The streets were empty, save for a stray cat that darted across the road and disappeared into the shadows. Ellie felt a chill run down her spine as she took in the silence. It wasn't the quiet of peacefulness, but the quiet of something lurking just beneath the surface. She gripped the strap of her camera bag tighter and walked toward the center of town, her footsteps echoing unnaturally loud in the stillness. The town square was small, dominated by a crumbling fountain that no longer worked. The water inside was stagnant, covered in a thick layer of green algae. Surrounding the square were a handful of buildings: a general store, a post office, and what looked like an old church with its steeple leaning precariously to one side. Ellie noticed that the windows of the buildings were dark, despite the fading daylight, and the only sound she could hear was the distant cawing of crows. She felt as though she was being watched, though she couldn't see anyone around. Ellie had come to Black Hollow on a lead. A week ago, she had received an anonymous letter in the mail, postmarked from the town. The letter was written in hurried, shaky handwriting, and it spoke of strange rituals, disappearances, and a cult that operated in secret. The writer had begged for someone to come and investigate, but they hadn't signed their name. Ellie, always drawn to the unexplained, had packed her bags and driven straight here. Now, standing in the silent square, she wondered if she had made a mistake. She approached the general store, hoping to find someone who could give her information. The bell above the door jingled as she stepped inside, and the smell of dust and old wood hit her immediately. The store was dimly lit, with shelves packed with canned goods, jars of preserves, and other essentials. Behind the counter stood an elderly man with a gaunt face and deep-set eyes. He looked up from the newspaper he was reading and stared at her with an expression that was somewhere between suspicion and fear. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice low and gravelly. Ellie forced a smile and introduced herself, explaining that she was a journalist researching the history of small towns in the area. The man's eyes narrowed slightly, as if he didn't believe her, but he nodded slowly. "Not much history here," he muttered. "Just a quiet place. Nothing worth writing about." Ellie pressed him gently, asking about the town's population and any local legends, but the man was evasive, his answers short and clipped. After a few minutes of awkward conversation, Ellie bought a bottle of water and a pack of crackers, thanked the man, and left the store. As she stepped back into the square, she noticed a group of people gathered near the church. They were standing in a loose circle, their heads bowed slightly, as if in prayer. Ellie reached for her camera, but before she could take a photo, one of them looked up and locked eyes with her. The man's expression was cold and unreadable, and Ellie felt a shiver run through her. She quickly lowered the camera and walked away, her heart pounding. The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and red, but the beauty of the scene was lost on Ellie. She felt an increasing sense of unease as she walked through the town, her footsteps the only sound in the growing darkness. She passed by more houses, their windows dark and their yards overgrown with weeds. Some of the houses had strange symbols carved into their doors, symbols that Ellie didn't recognize but that made her stomach twist with dread. She finally reached the Black Hollow Inn, a small, two-story building on the edge of town. The inn looked as old as the rest of the town, with its sagging roof and peeling paint, but it was the only place to stay. Ellie pushed open the creaking front door and entered the dimly lit lobby. A woman sat behind the counter, her face illuminated by the warm glow of a single lamp. She looked up at Ellie and smiled, but the smile didn't reach her eyes. "Welcome to Black Hollow," the woman said. "Are you here to stay the night?" Ellie nodded and handed over her ID, trying to shake off the feeling of being watched. The woman, who introduced herself as Mrs. Hargrove, handed her a key to room 3. "It's on the second floor," she said. "Breakfast is at 7. Don't be late." Ellie thanked her and climbed the stairs, the wood creaking under her weight. The hallway was narrow and poorly lit, with a single flickering bulb casting long shadows on the walls. She found her room and unlocked the door, stepping inside. The room was small and sparsely furnished, with a narrow bed, a wooden dresser, and a single window that overlooked the forest. Ellie set her bags down and sat on the edge of the bed, feeling exhausted but too on edge to rest. She pulled out the anonymous letter from her bag and read it again, hoping to find some clue she had missed before. The words seemed even more ominous now that she was in the town. "They worship in the shadows," the letter read. "They're not human anymore." As the night deepened, the silence outside was broken by the sound of distant chanting. Ellie's breath caught in her throat as she stood and walked to the window. The sound was faint but unmistakable, a low, rhythmic murmur that seemed to come from the forest. She peered through the window, but the trees were too dense, and she couldn't see anything. The chanting grew louder for a moment, then faded away, leaving the night in silence once more. Ellie sat back down on the bed, her hands trembling slightly. She had visited plenty of strange places in her career, but something about Black Hollow felt different. It felt wrong, as if the town itself was alive and watching her. She knew she wouldn't be able to sleep, so she decided to keep watch, her camera and notebook ready in case something happened. The night stretched on, and the silence grew heavier, pressing down on her like a weight. Just before dawn, Ellie heard a noise outside her door. It was soft, almost imperceptible, like the sound of footsteps creeping down the hallway. She froze, her heart racing, and listened. The footsteps stopped right outside her door, and for a moment, everything was still. Then she heard the sound of breathing, low and steady, just on the other side of the door. Ellie held her breath, too afraid to move. After what felt like an eternity, the footsteps retreated, and the hallway was silent once more. When the sun finally rose, casting its pale light over the town, Ellie felt as though she had survived the night by sheer willpower. She packed her things quickly and left the inn, determined to uncover the secrets of Black Hollow. The town seemed different in the daylight, less ominous but no less unsettling. Ellie knew she was walking into something dangerous, but she couldn't turn back now. Something dark was hiding in this town, and she was going to find it. The days in Black Hollow passed in a strange, uneasy rhythm. Ellie spent her mornings interviewing the few townsfolk willing to speak with her, though their answers were always vague and guarded. She learned little about the town's history or its people, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was profoundly wrong here. The townsfolk avoided eye contact, their voices hushed as if afraid of being overheard. Even the children played in silence, their games devoid of laughter. Ellie's instincts told her that the answer she sought wouldn't come from daylight conversations, but from what happened when the sun went down. Ellie's investigation led her to the forest on the outskirts of town. The woods were dense and ancient, with towering trees that blocked out much of the sunlight. The locals warned her to stay away, claiming that people who went into the forest at night never returned. But Ellie, driven by curiosity and a growing sense of urgency, decided to ignore their warnings. She waited until dusk, then packed her camera, a flashlight, and a small notebook, determined to uncover the truth. The forest seemed to breathe as she stepped inside, the air thick with the scent of pine and decay. The deeper she went, the darker it became. The trees loomed overhead like silent sentinels, their branches twisting into grotesque shapes. Ellie's flashlight cast a narrow beam of light, barely cutting through the oppressive darkness. She walked cautiously, her footsteps muffled by the thick layer of leaves underfoot. Every sound, the rustle of leaves, the snap of a twig, made her heart skip a beat. She felt as though the forest was alive, watching her every move, waiting for her to make a mistake. But she pressed on, driven by the need to understand what was happening in this town. After what felt like hours, Ellie stumbled upon a clearing. The moon, nearly full, cast a pale silver light over the scene. The sight before her made her freeze in place. A group of people stood in a circle, their faces obscured by hooded cloaks. In the center of the circle was a stone altar, its surface stained dark with what Ellie could only guess was blood. Around the altar were candles, their flickering light casting eerie shadows on the figures. The air was thick with the scent of incense, and something metallic and a low, rhythmic chanting filled the silence. Ellie's breath caught in her throat as she realized she had found the cult. She crouched behind a tree, her camera ready, though her hands shook slightly. She knew she had to document this, but the sight before her was almost too much to bear. The chanting grew louder, rising in a crescendo that seemed to vibrate through the forest. Then, one of the figures stepped forward, holding a long, curved knife. Ellie's heart pounded as she realized what was about to happen. She raised her camera and began taking photos, the sound of the shutter masked by the chanting. But as she focused on the scene, one of the figures turned their head, and their eyes locked with hers. Ellie swore under her breath and ducked lower, hoping she hadn't been seen. The chanting stopped abruptly, and the clearing fell into silence. Ellie held her breath, her body tensed as she listened for any sign that they had spotted her. After a tense moment, the chanting resumed, and she cautiously peeked out from behind the tree. The figure with the knife raised it high, and Ellie watched in horror as they brought it down on the person lying on the altar. She couldn't see the victim's face, but their scream echoed through the forest, a sound of pure terror and agony. Ellie felt sick to her stomach, but she forced herself to keep watching. The figures continued their ritual, their movements precise and practiced. The victim's screams faded into silence, and the chanting grew louder, more fervent. Ellie knew she should leave, should run as far away as possible, but she couldn't tear her eyes away. She needed to understand, to gather as much evidence as she could. She snapped more photos, her hands trembling so badly that the images would likely be blurred. But she didn't care. She had proof now, proof that something monstrous was happening in this town. The ritual lasted for what felt like an eternity. When it finally ended, the figures extinguished the candles and began to disperse, their hooded forms melting into the shadows of the forest. Ellie waited until they were gone before she dared to move. Her legs were stiff from crouching, and her mind was racing with what she had just witnessed. She knew she needed to get out of the forest, needed to find a way to expose the cult and save the people of Black Hollow. But as she turned to leave, she heard a rustling sound behind her. Ellie froze, her heart pounding. The sound grew louder, and she realized it wasn't the wind or an animal. Someone or something was closing in on her. She turned her flashlight off and pressed herself against the tree, hoping to blend into the darkness. The rustling stopped, and for a moment, everything was still. Then she felt a hand clamp down on her shoulder. Ellie stifled a scream as she was yanked backward, her camera slipping from her hands and landing on the forest floor with a dull thud. "You shouldn't be here," a voice hissed in her ear. It was a man's voice, low and menacing. Ellie struggled against his grip, but he was too strong. He dragged her deeper into the forest, away from the clearing and the safety of the path. Ellie's mind raced, trying to think of a way to escape, but her thoughts were clouded by fear. The man's grip tightened, and he leaned closer, his breath hot on her neck. "You've seen too much," he growled. "Now you'll be one of us, or you'll be one of them." Before Ellie could respond, a figure emerged from the shadows, blocking their path. The man holding her hesitated, and Ellie took the opportunity to wrench herself free. She stumbled backward, her eyes darting between the two figures. The newcomer stepped into the faint moonlight, and Ellie recognized him as Thomas, the young man she had seen around town. He had a determined look on his face, and he held a rusted machete in his hand. "Let her go," Thomas said, his voice steady. "She's not part of this." The man who had grabbed Ellie hesitated, then turned and disappeared into the forest. Ellie collapsed to the ground, her legs giving out beneath her. She looked up at Thomas, her breath coming in ragged gasps. What just happened?" she managed to ask. Thomas knelt beside her, his expression grim. "You're in over your head," he said. "This town, it's not what it seems. If you want to survive, you need to listen to me." Ellie nodded, too shaken to argue. She knew she had stumbled into something far bigger and far darker than she had ever imagined. Thomas helped her to her feet and led her out of the forest, his machete still in hand. The walk back to town was silent, both of them on edge, listening for any sign that they were being followed. When they reached the edge of the forest, Thomas stopped and turned to Ellie. "You can't stay here," he said. "They know you've seen them, and they won't let you leave. Unless you want to end up on that altar, you need to get out of Black Hollow tonight." Ellie shook her head, her determination returning despite her fear. "I can't leave," she said. "Not until I stop them." Thomas sighed, his expression a mix of frustration and admiration. "You're braver than most," he said. "But bravery won't save you from what's coming. If you stay, you'll need to be smarter than them. And you'll need my help." Ellie nodded, grateful for his offer. She knew she couldn't do this alone, and Thomas seemed to be the only person in town who wasn't under the cult's control. Together, they walked back to the inn, the weight of what they had seen hanging heavy over them. By the time they reached the inn, the sky was beginning to lighten with the first hints of dawn. Ellie felt exhausted, her body and mind pushed to their limits. But she knew she couldn't rest, not yet. She had photos and notes from the ritual, and she needed to figure out a plan. Thomas accompanied her to her room, making sure no one was following them. Before he left, he turned to Ellie and said, "Be careful. They're always watching." Ellie nodded, her heart heavy with fear but also determination. She had seen the darkness in Black Hollow, and she knew she couldn't turn her back on it now. As the sun rose, Ellie sat at the small desk in her room, staring at the photos she had taken. The images were blurry, but the horror of the ritual was still clear. She knew she had stumbled upon something ancient and evil, something that had taken root in this town and was feeding on its people. But she also knew she couldn't let it continue. She had to stop the cult, no matter the cost. With Thomas's help, she would uncover the truth and she would bring it into the light. Ellie spent the next few days piecing together what she had learned about the cult. Thomas proved to be an invaluable ally, providing her with insights into the town's history and the people involved. According to Thomas, the cult was called the Order of the Eternal Night, and it had existed in Black Hollow for generations. Its members worshipped an ancient deity known as Nyx, a being that demanded blood sacrifices in exchange for power and protection. The cult was led by a woman named Seraphine Blackwood, a figure shrouded in mystery and fear. Seraphine was said to be the descendant of the town's founders, and her influence over the cult was absolute. Thomas described her as both beautiful and terrifying, with an aura of power that made even the bravest men tremble. Rumors swirled about her immortality, with some claiming she had lived for over a century without aging a day. Ellie wasn't sure how much of it was true, but she knew Seraphine was the key to understanding and dismantling the cult. She needed to learn more about her, but getting close to Seraphine would be dangerous. Thomas warned Ellie to be cautious. "Seraphine knows everything that happens in this town," he said. "If she finds out you're investigating her, you're as good as dead." But Ellie was undeterred. She had come too far to turn back now. She began asking subtle questions around town, trying to gather information without drawing attention to herself. Most of the townsfolk refused to speak about Seraphine, their faces pale with fear at the mention of her name. But Ellie managed to learn that Seraphine lived in a grand, secluded manor on the edge of town, surrounded by dense woods. The manor was said to be as old as the town itself, a sprawling Gothic structure with turrets, stained glass windows, and a history steeped in blood. Ellie knew she needed to see it for herself, but approaching it directly would be suicide. Instead, she decided to observe it from a distance, hoping to catch a glimpse of Seraphine or learn more about her daily routines. With Thomas's help, she found a vantage point in the woods near the manor, where they could watch the property without being seen. The first night of their surveillance was uneventful. The manor was dark and silent, its windows like empty eyes staring out into the night. Ellie and Thomas waited for hours, their breath visible in the cold night air, but nothing happened. Just as Ellie was about to suggest they leave, the front door of the manor opened, and a figure stepped out onto the porch. Ellie's heart skipped a beat as she realized it was Seraphine. She was even more striking than Ellie had imagined, with long, raven-black hair, pale skin, and piercing green eyes that seemed to glow in the moonlight. Seraphine walked across the lawn, her movements graceful and deliberate, as if she was floating rather than walking. She stopped at the edge of the woods and raised her arms, her lips moving silently as if in prayer. The air around her seemed to shift, and Ellie felt a strange, oppressive energy pressing down on her. Thomas grabbed her arm, his grip tight, and whispered, "We need to leave. Now." But Ellie was transfixed, unable to tear her eyes away from Seraphine. She felt as though she was being pulled toward her, as if by some invisible force. Before Ellie could react, Seraphine turned her head, and their eyes met. Ellie's breath caught in her throat as Seraphine's lips curled into a knowing smile. For a moment, Ellie felt as though her very soul was being laid bare, examined and judged. Then Seraphine turned and walked back into the manor, the door closing behind her with a soft click. Ellie stumbled backward, her legs trembling, and leaned against a tree for support. Thomas grabbed her arm and pulled her away, insisting they leave before Seraphine sent someone after them. Back at the inn, Ellie sat on the edge of her bed, her mind racing. She had seen Seraphine, had felt her presence, and it had shaken her to her core. She knew now that Seraphine wasn't just a charismatic leader, she was something more, something ancient and powerful. But Ellie also knew that she couldn't let her fear stop her. She had to find a way to confront Seraphine, to understand her motives and uncover the truth about the cult. Thomas, however, was less optimistic. "You're playing with fire," he said. "Seraphine isn't someone you can just outsmart." Over the next few days, Ellie continued her investigation, though she was more cautious than ever. She avoided the manor and stuck to the outskirts of town, hoping to learn more about the cult's activities without drawing Seraphine's attention. Her efforts paid off when she discovered a hidden meeting place in the woods, where the cult gathered to prepare for their rituals. The site was marked by strange symbols carved into trees and piles of bones arranged in intricate patterns. Ellie documented everything, knowing it would be crucial evidence when or if she was able to expose the cult. One evening, as Ellie was returning to the inn, she noticed a figure waiting for her in the shadows. Her heart leaped into her throat, but she forced herself to stay calm. As she approached, the figure stepped into the light, and Ellie recognized her as one of the townsfolk, a woman named Margaret, who had been particularly reluctant to speak with her earlier. Margaret looked pale and nervous, her eyes darting around as if afraid of being watched. "I need to talk to you," she whispered, her voice trembling. "But not here. They're watching." Ellie's pulse quickened. She had been hoping for a breakthrough like this. She followed Margaret to a small, abandoned shed on the edge of town, where they could speak without being overheard. Once inside, Margaret turned to Ellie and said, "I know what you're doing. I know you're trying to stop her." Ellie nodded, her excitement tempered by the fear in Margaret's eyes. "What can you tell me about Seraphine?" she asked. Margaret hesitated, then said, "She's not human. She's something else. And she'll do whatever it takes to keep her power." Margaret went on to describe how Seraphine manipulated the townsfolk, using a combination of fear and a strange brew to keep them loyal. She also revealed that Seraphine had a network of spies throughout the town, watching for anyone who might oppose her. "If she finds out I'm talking to you, I'm dead," Margaret said, her voice breaking. "But I can't keep living like this. I can't keep watching people die." Ellie thanked her and promised to do everything in her power to stop Seraphine. But as she left the shed, she knew the stakes had just gotten higher. The next morning, Ellie woke to find a note slipped under her door. It was written in the same shaky handwriting as the anonymous letter that had brought her to Black Hollow. The message was short but chilling. "You're not safe here. Leave while you still can." Ellie felt a cold knot of fear in her stomach. Seraphine knew she was investigating her, and she was sending a clear warning. But Ellie couldn't leave, not now, not when she was so close. She crumpled the note and tossed it into the fireplace, her resolve hardening. She would confront Seraphine, whatever the cost. That night, Ellie dreamed of the manor. She was standing in the grand hallway, surrounded by portraits of Blackwood ancestors, their eyes following her as she walked. At the end of the hall, Seraphine waited, her smile cold and predatory. "You think you can stop me?" she said, her voice echoing in the empty space. "You're nothing but a pawn in my game." Ellie woke in a cold sweat, her heart pounding. She knew it was more than a dream, it was a message. Seraphine was toying with her, testing her resolve. But Ellie wasn't going to back down. She would face Seraphine, even if it meant risking her life. Ellie's investigation into Seraphine and the cult took on a new urgency after the warning note. She knew she was running out of time, but she also knew she couldn't afford to be reckless. Thomas had become her closest ally, and together they devised a plan to infiltrate the cult's inner circle. It was a dangerous gamble, but Ellie believed it was the only way to gather the evidence she needed. Thomas, however, was far from convinced. "You're playing right into Seraphine's hands," he warned. "She's always one step ahead. If you walk into this trap, you're not coming back." Despite Thomas's protests, Ellie pressed on. She spent her days scouting the town for potential leads, her nights poring over the photos and notes she had gathered. The townsfolk were more wary of her than ever, their eyes following her wherever she went. Ellie could feel the tension in the air, like a storm about to break. She knew she was being watched, but she tried to ignore the feeling, focusing on her mission. Then, one evening, she received an unexpected visitor at the inn, a man named Ezekiel, who claimed to be a former member of the cult. Ezekiel was a tall, gaunt man with hollow eyes and a haunted expression. He approached Ellie as she sat in the inn's dimly lit dining room, his voice low and urgent. "I know what you're doing," he said, his eyes darting around the room. "And I want to help." Ellie was cautious but intrigued. Ezekiel claimed that he had escaped the cult years ago but had been living in hiding ever since. He offered to tell her everything he knew about Seraphine and the Order of the Eternal Night, but he insisted they speak somewhere private. Ellie agreed, though she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. They left the inn and walked to an abandoned building on the edge of town, the same shed where Ellie had met Margaret. Ezekiel locked the door behind them and turned to Ellie, his expression serious. "What do you know about Nyx?" he asked. Ellie shook her head, her heart racing. "Not much," she admitted. "Just that the cult worships her." Ezekiel nodded, his face grim. "Nyx isn't just a god," he said. "She's a force of destruction. Seraphine believes she can harness that power, but she's playing with fire. If Nyx is fully awakened, it won't just be Black Hollow that suffers, it'll be the entire world." Ellie listened intently as Ezekiel described the rituals he had participated in, the blood sacrifices, and the unnatural phenomena that seemed to surround Seraphine. He spoke of visions, of voices that whispered in the darkness, and of a book, the Tome of Nyx, that contained the secrets of the cult's power. "That book is the key," Ezekiel said. "If you can destroy it, you can stop her." Ellie nodded, her mind racing. She knew finding the tome would be nearly impossible, but it was a lead she couldn't ignore. "Where is it?" she asked. Ezekiel hesitated, then said, "It's in the manor." Before Ellie could respond, the door of the shed burst open, and 3 men in hooded cloaks stormed in. Ellie's heart sank as she realized she had been set up. Ezekiel's face twisted into a cruel smile as he stepped back, his eyes cold and empty. "I'm sorry, Ellie," he said. "But Seraphine was very clear about what would happen if I didn't bring you to her." The men grabbed Ellie before she could react, their grips like iron. She struggled, but they were too strong. One of them pressed a cloth soaked in chemicals over her mouth and nose, and the world went black. When Ellie woke, she was in a dark, cold room. The walls were made of rough stone, and the air smelled of damp earth and mold. She tried to move but found her wrists and ankles bound to a wooden chair. Panic surged through her as she realized she was in the manor, the very place she had been trying to avoid. Across the room, Seraphine sat in a high-backed chair, her expression calm and composed. "Welcome, Eleanor," she said, her voice smooth as silk. "I've been waiting for you." Ellie glared at her, her fear masked by anger. "What do you want?" she demanded. Seraphine smiled, a cold, predatory smile that sent shivers down Ellie's spine. "You've been poking your nose where it doesn't belong," she said. "I admire your courage, but it's time to put an end to your little investigation." Ellie's mind raced as she tried to think of a way out, but she was trapped both physically and mentally. Seraphine stood and walked over to her, her movements slow and deliberate. She tilted Ellie's chin up, forcing her to look into her piercing green eyes. "You have a choice," she said. "Join us, or become a sacrifice to Nyx." Ellie's stomach churned at the thought, but she forced herself to appear calm. "Why would I ever join you?" she asked, her voice steady despite her fear. Seraphine's smile widened. "Because you're smarter than most," she said. "Because you have a thirst for knowledge, a hunger for the truth. Nyx can give you that and so much more." Ellie shook her head, refusing to give in. "I'll never join you," she said. Seraphine's expression hardened, and she stepped back. "Very well," she said. "If you insist on being difficult, we'll do this the hard way." The men who had abducted Ellie stepped forward, their faces obscured by their hoods. One of them carried a knife, its blade glinting in the dim light. Ellie's heart pounded as they untied her from the chair and dragged her to her feet. She struggled, but it was no use. They forced her down a narrow hallway, their footsteps echoing on the stone floor. The air grew colder as they descended a set of stairs, and Ellie realized they were taking her to the manor's basement. She tried to memorize the layout, hoping for a chance to escape, but her captors were too vigilant. The basement was a cavernous room filled with strange artifacts, ancient weapons, strange symbols carved into the walls, and a large stone altar at the center. Ellie's blood ran cold as she realized what was about to happen. The men forced her onto the altar, binding her wrists and ankles with thick ropes. She tried to scream, but her voice was hoarse from the struggle. Seraphine appeared at her side, holding the tome of Nyx in one hand and a ceremonial dagger in the other. "You had your chance," she said. "Now you'll serve Nyx in another way." As Seraphine began to chant in a language Ellie didn't recognize, the room seemed to grow darker, the shadows twisting and writhing as if alive. Ellie's mind raced, searching for a way out, but she was completely helpless. She closed her eyes, bracing herself for the inevitable. Then, just as Seraphine raised the dagger, the door to the basement burst open, and a figure charged in. It was Thomas, his face determined and his hands gripping a rusty crowbar. He swung it at one of the cultists, knocking him to the ground, and the room erupted into chaos. "Ellie!" Thomas shouted, his voice cutting through the pandemonium. She twisted her head to see him fighting off another cultist, his movements quick and desperate. Seraphine's chanting faltered, and she turned to face Thomas, her expression a mix of rage and disbelief. "You dare interfere?" she hissed. Thomas didn't respond, too focused on freeing Ellie. He managed to cut her bonds with a pocket knife, and she scrambled off the altar, her legs shaky but functional. "We need to go," Thomas yelled, grabbing her arm and pulling her toward the door. Ellie didn't need to be told twice. She followed Thomas as they sprinted out of the basement, the sounds of the cultists' shouts echoing behind them. They raced through the manor, dodging obstacles and narrowly avoiding capture. Finally, they burst out into the cold night air, the manor looming behind them like a monstrous shadow. Thomas didn't stop running until they were deep in the woods, far from the cult's reach. Ellie collapsed against a tree, her breath coming in ragged gasps. "You saved me," she said, her voice trembling. Thomas nodded, his face grim. "But this isn't over," he said. "Seraphine won't let us go that easily." Ellie and Thomas stood in the dense forest, the darkness of the night wrapping around them like a shroud. The escape from the manor had left them both shaken, but there was no time to rest. Seraphine would be hunting them, and Ellie knew they had to act quickly. "We need to destroy that tome," she said, her voice low but determined. Thomas nodded, his face grim. "If the book is as powerful as Ezekiel claimed, it's the only way to stop her. But finding it won't be easy." They made their way to a small, hidden cabin Thomas had been using as a safe house. Inside, the air was stale and cold, but it was safer than being out in the open. Thomas lit a lantern, casting a warm glow over the sparse room. Ellie sat on a wooden stool, trying to gather her thoughts. She recounted everything Ezekiel had told her about the Tome of Nyx, its location in the manor, the rituals it was used for, and the danger it posed. "We need to get back into the manor," she said, though the thought made her stomach churn. Thomas frowned. "You're lucky to be alive. Going back is suicide." But Ellie was resolute. "If we don't destroy that book, more people will die. I can't let that happen." Thomas watched her for a long moment, then sighed. "You're as stubborn as they come," he said. "But if you're set on this, I'll help you. We'll need a plan, though. We can't just waltz in there." Ellie nodded, grateful for his support. They spent the next few hours devising a strategy, using Thomas's knowledge of the manor's layout and Ellie's determination to map out their approach. It was risky, but it was the best chance they had. The following night, under the cover of darkness, Ellie and Thomas returned to the manor. The grand structure loomed before them, its windows dark and its walls seemingly alive with shadows. Ellie's heart pounded as they approached, but she forced her fears aside. They slipped through a side entrance Thomas had used before, finding themselves in a narrow, dimly lit hallway. The air was thick with the scent of incense and something metallic, and the silence was unnerving. "Stay close," Thomas whispered, his voice barely audible. "And don't touch anything." They moved cautiously through the manor, avoiding the areas where cultists were likely to be stationed. Ellie's nerves were on edge, every creak of the floorboards making her jump. Thomas led her to a hidden stairwell that descended into the basement, where they believed the tome was kept. The stairs were steep and narrow, the walls closing in around them as they went deeper underground. Ellie's flashlight cast a shaky beam of light, revealing ancient stone walls and strange symbols etched into the stone. She couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. When they reached the basement, Ellie was struck by the oppressive atmosphere. The room was vast, with a high ceiling and walls lined with shelves filled with jars, books, and artifacts. At the center of the room was the stone altar where Ellie had nearly been sacrificed, its surface still stained dark. The Tome of Nyx was resting on a pedestal near the altar, its cover adorned with intricate carvings that seemed to shift and writhe in the dim light. "That's it," Ellie whispered, her voice trembling. "But how do we destroy it?" Thomas approached the tome cautiously, his hand hovering over the cover as if afraid to touch it. "It's cursed," he said. "We can't just burn it, it'll fight back." Ellie walked over to the altar, her mind racing. She noticed a nearby table cluttered with ritual items, candles, knives, and a small bowl filled with a dark red liquid. Among the items was a book with handwritten notes, its pages filled with diagrams and instructions. Ellie picked it up, her pulse quickening as she realized it was Seraphine's journal. "This might help us," she said, flipping through the pages. The journal detailed the creation of the Tome of Nyx, describing how it was bound with blood and imbued with dark magic. It also contained notes on how to destroy it, though the process was complex and dangerous. Ellie read aloud. "The tome can only be unmade through the use of the flame of ether, a fire fueled by purity and sacrifice. The flame must be ignited with a drop of the caster's blood and held against the tome until it is consumed." Thomas frowned. "Sacrifice? What does that mean?" Ellie hesitated, then said, "It means whoever does this might not survive." Before they could discuss it further, the sound of footsteps echoed from the stairwell. Ellie's heart leaped into her throat as she realized the cultists were coming. "We're out of time," Thomas said, his voice urgent. "We need to do this now." Ellie nodded, her hands trembling as she set the journal aside and picked up a knife from the table. She held it to her palm, hesitating for a moment before making a small cut. Blood welled up, and she squeezed it into the bowl of liquid, which began to emit a faint, eerie glow. "Keep watch," she said to Thomas, her voice steady despite her fear. Ellie dipped her finger into the glowing liquid and traced a symbol on the cover of the Tome of Nyx, as described in the journal. The book shuddered violently, as if alive, and Ellie felt a wave of dark energy pulse through the room. She ignored it and took a candle from the table, holding it to the bowl. The flame flickered to life, its light pure and bright against the surrounding darkness. Ellie brought the flame to the tome, her hands shaking as she held it against the cover. The book let out a low, guttural groan, and the flames began to spread. The room filled with an otherworldly shriek as the tome burned, the pages curling and blackening as the dark magic within was consumed. Ellie felt a searing pain in her hand, as though the flame was feeding on her life force, but she didn't let go. Thomas stood beside her, his eyes wide with fear and awe. "Ellie, you have to stop," he shouted, but she shook her head. "It's almost done," she said through gritted teeth. The flames grew brighter, and the tome's groans grew louder, until finally, with a deafening crack, the book disintegrated into ash. The room fell silent, the oppressive darkness lifting as the tome was destroyed. Ellie collapsed to the ground, her body weak and her hand burned. Thomas knelt beside her, his expression filled with concern. "You did it," he said, his voice filled with awe. "You destroyed it." Ellie managed a weak smile, though the pain was overwhelming. "It's over," she whispered. But as she spoke, she felt a cold presence behind her. She turned to see Seraphine standing in the doorway, her face twisted with rage. "You think this is over?" Seraphine hissed. "You've only made things worse." Seraphine stepped forward, her eyes glowing with an unnatural light. Ellie tried to stand, but her body was too weak. Thomas moved in front of her, shielding her from Seraphine's wrath. "Stay back," he shouted, though his voice wavered. Seraphine laughed, a cold, mirthless sound that echoed through the room. "You've destroyed the tome, but you've unleashed something far worse," she said. "Nyx is awake and she's coming for us all." Ellie's heart sank as she realized the true cost of their victory. The battle wasn't over, it had only just begun. The room was filled with an oppressive silence as Seraphine's words hung in the air. Ellie sat on the cold stone floor, her body weak and her mind reeling from what she had just done. Destroying the Tome of Nyx had been her only hope of stopping the cult, but now she wasn't sure if she had made things worse. Seraphine stood in the doorway, her expression a mix of rage and triumph, her glowing eyes fixed on Ellie. "Do you feel it?" she asked, her voice low and menacing. "Nyx is awake, and now nothing will stop her." Ellie's heart pounded as she tried to process what Seraphine was saying. She looked at Thomas, who was still standing protectively in front of her, his face pale with fear. "What do you mean, she's awake?" Ellie asked, her voice trembling. Seraphine stepped closer, her movements slow and deliberate, as if she was savoring the moment. "The tome was a seal," she said. "It kept Nyx contained, but now that it's destroyed, she is free. And she will claim this world as her own." Ellie felt a cold knot of fear tighten in her chest. She had meant to stop the cult, but instead, she might have unleashed something far more dangerous. Seraphine turned her gaze to Thomas, her lips curling into a cruel smile. "You've helped the girl destroy my plans," she said. "But it doesn't matter. Nyx will reward me for freeing her. And you will be nothing but a sacrifice." Before Thomas could react, Seraphine raised her hand, and an invisible force flung him across the room. He hit the wall with a sickening thud and crumpled to the ground, unmoving. Ellie cried out and tried to crawl toward him, but her body was too weak. Seraphine stepped closer, her shadow looming over Ellie like a dark cloud. "You've been a thorn in my side from the moment you arrived," Seraphine said, her voice cold and ruthless. "But now, you'll serve Nyx in the most painful way possible." Ellie's mind raced, searching for a way out, but she was completely defenseless. Seraphine knelt beside her, her hand reaching out to grab Ellie's chin. Her touch was like ice, sending shivers down Ellie's spine. "You should have left when you had the chance," Seraphine whispered. "Now, you'll suffer for your meddling." Ellie's vision blurred as Seraphine's grip tightened, and she felt herself slipping into unconsciousness. When Ellie woke, she was in a dimly lit room, her wrists and ankles bound to a cold metal chair. The air was thick with the scent of incense and something metallic, and the walls were covered in strange symbols that seemed to pulse with an eerie light. She tried to move, but the ropes were too tight, cutting into her skin. Across the room, Seraphine stood by a table, her back to Ellie. She was murmuring in a low, chanting voice, her hands moving over a bowl filled with a dark, swirling liquid. Ellie's heart raced as she realized she was in the middle of another ritual. "What are you doing?" Ellie demanded, her voice shaking with fear and anger. Seraphine turned to face her, her expression calm but her eyes burning with an unnatural light. "I'm preparing the final ritual," she said. "Nyx is awake, but she needs a vessel to fully manifest in this world. And you, my dear, will be that vessel." Ellie's blood ran cold. "You're insane," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "You can't control her." Seraphine smiled, a cold, predatory smile that sent shivers down Ellie's spine. "I don't need to control her," she said. "I just need to guide her." Ellie's mind raced as she tried to think of a way to escape, but the ropes were too tight, and she was too weak. She glanced around the room, searching for anything that could help her. Her eyes fell on a nearby shelf, where a small, silver knife lay among the ritual items. It was just out of reach, but if she could somehow get to it, she might have a chance. Seraphine turned back to the table, her attention focused on the ritual. Ellie knew this was her only opportunity. She twisted her wrists, trying to loosen the ropes, but they only dug deeper into her skin. Despite the pain, Ellie refused to give up. She shifted her weight, rocking the chair back and forth, trying to inch closer to the shelf. Seraphine's chanting grew louder, the room seeming to vibrate with the sound. Ellie's heart pounded as she finally managed to tip the chair over, crashing to the floor with a loud thud. The impact knocked the knife from the shelf, and it landed just within reach. Seraphine turned, her eyes blazing with rage, but Ellie didn't hesitate. She grabbed the knife and began sawing at the ropes, her hands trembling but determined. "You think you can escape?" Seraphine hissed, stepping toward her. "You're only delaying the inevitable." Ellie ignored her, focusing on cutting through the ropes. Just as Seraphine reached her, the ropes fell away. Ellie scrambled to her feet, holding the knife out in front of her like a shield. Seraphine laughed, a cold, mirthless sound that echoed through the room. "You can't fight me," she said. "You can't fight her." Ellie's heart raced as she backed away, her eyes darting around the room, searching for an exit. But the only way out was through Seraphine. Ellie took a deep breath, trying to steady her nerves. "You're wrong," she said, her voice trembling but defiant. "I'm not going to let you win." Seraphine's smile faded, replaced by a look of pure fury. She lunged at Ellie, her hands clawed like talons. Ellie ducked and swung the knife, catching Seraphine's arm. Seraphine let out a hiss of pain and stepped back, her eyes blazing with rage. "You'll pay for that," she snarled, her voice cold and menacing. Ellie knew she couldn't win a fight against Seraphine, but she also knew she couldn't give up. The room seemed to shift and twist around them, the shadows writhing as if alive. Seraphine's chanting grew louder, echoing in the air like 1,000 voices. Ellie felt a wave of dark energy press down on her, making it hard to breathe. She knew she was running out of time. With a desperate cry, she charged at Seraphine, the knife held out in front of her. Seraphine sidestepped, but Ellie managed to slash her arm again. Seraphine let out a scream of rage and pain, her blood dripping onto the floor. The room seemed to pulse with the sound, the shadows twisting and writhing. Ellie knew she couldn't keep fighting forever. Her body was weak, her strength fading with every movement. But she also knew she couldn't let Seraphine complete the ritual. With a final burst of energy, she lunged at Seraphine, tackling her to the ground. The two women struggled, their bodies twisting and writhing in the dim light. Ellie managed to pin Seraphine down, her knife poised above her heart. "This ends now," Ellie said, her voice trembling but firm. Seraphine's eyes widened with fear, but then she smiled, a cold, knowing smile that sent shivers down Ellie's spine. "You're too late," Seraphine whispered, her voice filled with triumph. "She's already here." Before Ellie could react, a wave of dark energy slammed into her, throwing her across the room. She hit the wall with a sickening thud and slumped to the ground, her vision blurring. Through the haze, she saw a dark, shapeless form emerging from the shadows, its presence filling the room with an overwhelming sense of dread. Seraphine rose to her feet, her face glowing with a mix of awe and fear. "Nyx," she whispered, her voice trembling with reverence. Ellie's heart sank as she realized the true extent of what she had unleashed. Ellie lay on the cold stone floor, her body aching and her vision blurred. The room was filled with an oppressive energy, the air heavy and electric, as the dark form of Nyx loomed in the shadows. She could feel the entity's presence, a cold, suffocating force that seemed to press down on her chest. Seraphine stood before Nyx, her arms raised in reverence, her face glowing with a mix of triumph and fear. "My goddess," she whispered, her voice trembling with awe. "I have done as you commanded. I have freed you." Ellie's heart pounded as she struggled to her feet, her legs shaky and weak. She knew she had to do something, but what could she possibly do against a being like Nyx? The dark form shifted, its shape indistinct but radiating an overwhelming sense of malevolence. Ellie's mind raced, searching for a way to stop the entity, but she felt utterly powerless. Then, she noticed Thomas's unconscious form crumpled against the wall. She stumbled toward him, hoping he was still alive. "Thomas," she whispered, shaking him gently. He groaned but didn't wake. The sound of Seraphine's voice pulled Ellie's attention back to the center of the room. "With this vessel," Seraphine said, gesturing to Ellie, "you will take form in this world, and it will be yours to command." Ellie's blood ran cold as she realized what Seraphine had planned for her. She wasn't just a sacrifice, she was meant to be Nyx's host. The thought filled her with dread, but it also sparked a flicker of determination. She couldn't let that happen, no matter the cost. Ellie reached for the silver knife that had fallen nearby, her grip tightening as she prepared to fight. Seraphine's chanting grew louder, her voice reverberating through the room as Nyx's form grew more defined. The shadows seemed to pulse and writhe, the air thick with a dark, oppressive energy. Ellie knew she was running out of time. With a desperate cry, she charged at Seraphine, the knife held out in front of her. Seraphine turned, her eyes blazing with fury, and raised her hand. An invisible force slammed into Ellie, throwing her backward. She hit the ground hard, the knife slipping from her grasp. Pain shot through her body, but she forced herself to get up again. "You can't stop this," Seraphine hissed, her voice cold and menacing. "Nyx is inevitable. She will consume this world, and you will be her vessel." Ellie glared at her, her fear masked by anger. "I'll die before I let that happen," she said, her voice trembling but firm. Seraphine laughed, a cold, mirthless sound that echoed through the room. "You have no choice," she said. "You're already too late." Ellie's heart sank as she looked at Nyx, the entity's form growing more solid with every passing moment. She knew Seraphine was right, she was running out of time. Then, Thomas stirred, his groans drawing Ellie's attention. She rushed to his side, her hands trembling as she shook him again. "Thomas, wake up!" she whispered urgently. He blinked, his eyes focusing slowly as he looked at her. "Ellie?" he said, his voice weak. "What's happening?" Ellie helped him sit up, her words rushed and frantic. "Nyx is awake. Seraphine is trying to use me as her vessel. We have to stop her, but I don't know how." Thomas's expression hardened as he looked at the scene unfolding in the center of the room. "We have to disrupt the ritual," he said. "If we can break the connection, we might be able to weaken her." Ellie nodded, her mind racing as she tried to think of a way to disrupt the ritual. Her eyes fell on the bowl of dark liquid Seraphine had been using, its contents swirling ominously. "That bowl," she said, pointing. "It's part of the ritual. If we destroy it, we might be able to stop her." Thomas nodded, though his face was pale with fear. "It's worth a shot," he said. "But how do we get to it?" Ellie glanced around the room, her eyes landing on a heavy candelabra nearby. "We'll have to fight our way through," she said, her voice steady despite her fear. Thomas struggled to his feet, leaning on Ellie for support. Together, they moved toward the candelabra, their movements slow and cautious. Seraphine's attention was focused on the ritual, her chanting growing louder and more intense. Nyx's form was almost fully realized now, a towering figure of darkness that seemed to radiate pure malevolence. Ellie's heart pounded as she and Thomas reached the candelabra. They lifted it together, its weight heavy but manageable. "Ready," Ellie whispered. Thomas nodded, his jaw set with determination. With a shared glance, they charged at Seraphine, the candelabra held out in front of them. Seraphine turned, her eyes widening with shock as she realized what they were doing. She raised her hand, but Ellie and Thomas were too close. They swung the candelabra with all their strength, smashing it into the bowl. The dark liquid erupted in a burst of black flame, the force of the explosion throwing them backward. Ellie hit the ground hard, her ears ringing and her vision blurring. She looked up to see Seraphine lying motionless on the ground, the ritual disrupted. For a moment, there was silence, the oppressive energy in the room dissipating. Ellie's heart leaped with hope as she thought they had succeeded. But then, Nyx's form began to shift, the shadows writhing and pulsing as the entity let out a low, guttural growl. Ellie's hope turned to dread as she realized the ritual had only been delayed, not stopped. "What do we do now?" Thomas asked, his voice trembling. Ellie's mind raced, but she had no answers. Nyx's form loomed over them, its presence overwhelming and terrifying. In that moment of desperation, Ellie remembered Seraphine's journal. She had read about the flame of ether, the only thing that could destroy the tome of Nyx. Maybe it could work against Nyx herself. "The flame," Ellie said, her voice frantic. "The flame of ether, it's the only thing that might stop her." Thomas looked at her, his face pale with fear. "But how do we use it?" Ellie glanced around the room, her eyes landing on the remnants of the bowl and the dark liquid. "We need to recreate it," she said. "But it'll take everything we have." Thomas nodded, though his hands were trembling. "What do we need to do?" Ellie took a deep breath, trying to steady her nerves. "We need purity and sacrifice," she said. "And blood, our blood." Thomas hesitated, but then he held out his hand. "Do it," he said. Ellie hesitated for a moment, but then she took the knife and made a small cut on Thomas's palm. He flinched but didn't pull away. Ellie did the same to her own hand, their blood dripping into the remnants of the bowl. The liquid began to glow faintly, the flame flickering to life. As the flame of ether grew brighter, Nyx let out a deafening roar, her form surging forward to stop them. Ellie and Thomas stood their ground, holding the bowl between them. "Now!" Ellie shouted. They threw the bowl at Nyx, the flame erupting into a brilliant burst of light as it hit the entity. Nyx let out a piercing shriek, her form writhing and twisting as the flame consumed her. The room filled with blinding light, and Ellie felt a wave of energy wash over her, knocking her to the ground. When the light faded, the room was silent. Nyx was gone, her form completely dissolved. Seraphine lay motionless on the ground, her body lifeless. Ellie sat up slowly, her body aching but her heart filled with relief. Thomas was beside her, his face pale but alive. "We did it," he said, his voice trembling with disbelief. Ellie nodded, tears of relief streaming down her face. "We did it," she echoed. The nightmare was finally over. Ellie sat on the cold stone floor of the manor's dungeon, her body bruised and her mind still reeling from the events of the night. The air was eerily quiet now, the oppressive darkness lifted, but the weight of what she had experienced lingered. Thomas sat beside her, his face pale and his hands trembling as he stared at the spot where Nyx had been. "Is it really over?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Ellie nodded slowly, though she wasn't entirely convinced herself. "I think so," she said. "But we need to make sure." They stood together, their movements slow and cautious, and began to search the room for any signs of lingering danger. The remnants of the ritual were scattered across the floor, broken candles, shattered bowls, and the ashes of the tome of Nyx. Ellie knelt beside the ashes, her fingers brushing against the cold, black powder. She couldn't help but feel a pang of guilt. She had destroyed the tome to stop Seraphine, but she had also unleashed Nyx. "Do you think we've undone everything?" she asked, her voice trembling. Thomas placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "You did what you had to do," he said. "It's over now. Seraphine is gone, and Nyx is gone. That's all that matters." Ellie nodded, though her heart still felt heavy. She looked at Seraphine's lifeless body, her expression twisted in a mix of anger and sorrow. For all the pain Seraphine had caused, Ellie couldn't help but feel a pang of pity. She had been a victim of Nyx's influence, just like everyone else in Black Hollow. "We need to leave this place," Ellie said, her voice firm, "before anyone finds us." They made their way out of the manor, their steps slow and deliberate, as if they were afraid the shadows might come alive again. The night air was cold and crisp, a stark contrast to the stifling darkness of the dungeon. Ellie took a deep breath, letting the fresh air fill her lungs as she tried to calm her racing thoughts. Thomas walked beside her, his face pale but his determination unwavering. "What will we do now?" he asked. Ellie hesitated, then said, "We need to make sure this never happens again. We need to warn people about Nyx and her cult." But as they walked down the quiet streets of Black Hollow, Ellie couldn't shake the feeling that something was still wrong. The town was eerily silent, the windows dark and the streets empty. It was as if the entire town had been abandoned. Ellie's heart raced as she realized what had happened. The townsfolk were gone, disappeared, just like the cult members who had been under Nyx's influence. "Where is everyone?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Thomas looked around, his face pale with fear. "I don't know," he said. "But we need to get out of here." They reached the edge of town and stopped, looking back at the darkened streets of Black Hollow. Ellie felt a pang of sorrow as she realized the town was lost. Nyx's influence had consumed it, and now it was nothing but a ghost town. "We can't stay here," she said, her voice firm. Thomas nodded, though his face was pale with fear. "Where will we go?" he asked. Ellie hesitated, then said, "We'll find somewhere safe, and we'll make sure no one ever falls victim to Nyx again." They left Black Hollow behind, their steps slow but determined as they walked down the deserted road. The night was quiet, the only sound the crunch of gravel beneath their feet. Ellie's mind raced as she tried to make sense of everything that had happened. She had come to Black Hollow to uncover the truth, but she had found something far darker and more dangerous than she could have imagined. Now, she had to decide what to do with everything she had learned. "We need to tell people," she said, her voice firm. "We need to warn them about Nyx and her cult." Thomas nodded, though his expression was grim. "People won't believe us," he said. "They'll think we're crazy." Ellie sighed, knowing he was right. But she also knew she couldn't keep this to herself. She had seen the darkness that Nyx was capable of, and she couldn't let it happen again. "We'll find a way," she said, her voice steady despite her fear. "We'll make them understand." Thomas hesitated, then nodded. "We'll do it together," he said. "I'm not leaving you." They walked in silence for a while, the weight of everything they had been through hanging heavy in the air. Ellie's mind wandered as she thought about what lay ahead. She had lost so much: her friends, her sense of security, even a part of herself, but she had also gained something. She had found strength she didn't know she had, and she had found an ally in Thomas. They might be scarred, but they were alive, and that was enough. "We'll be okay," Ellie said, her voice soft but firm. "We'll find a way to move forward." Thomas nodded, though his expression was still grim. "We'll find a way," he echoed. "But it won't be easy." Ellie knew he was right. The road ahead would be long and difficult, but she was ready. She had faced Nyx and survived, and she could face whatever came next. Together, she and Thomas would find a way to warn the world about the dangers of the Order of the Eternal Night. And they would make sure no one ever had to face what they had faced. As the first light of dawn began to break over the horizon, Ellie felt a flicker of hope. The darkness was behind them now, and though the road ahead was uncertain, she knew they could face it together. She looked at Thomas, his face pale but determined, and gave him a small smile. "We'll be okay," she said again, her voice firm with conviction. Thomas nodded, though his expression was still grim. "We'll be okay," he echoed. "But we'll never forget what happened here." They walked away from Black Hollow, their steps slow but steady as they left the town behind. Ellie knew she would never forget the horrors she had experienced, but she also knew she couldn't let them define her. She had a purpose now, a mission to make sure no one ever fell victim to Nyx and her cult again. And she would see it through, no matter the cost. The sun rose over the horizon, casting a warm light over the road ahead. Ellie took a deep breath, her heart filled with determination. The nightmare was over, and a new day had begun. The sun rose higher in the sky, casting a warm golden light over the road that stretched endlessly before them. Ellie walked beside Thomas, her steps steady but her mind still clouded by the events of the past few days. Black Hollow was now a distant memory, but the weight of its horrors lingered in her thoughts. She glanced at Thomas, his face pale and his eyes distant, and knew he was feeling the same. "We'll need to find shelter soon," she said, her voice quiet but firm. Thomas nodded, though he didn't say anything. The silence between them was heavy but comforting. They walked for hours, the road stretching endlessly before them, surrounded by fields and forests that seemed untouched by the darkness they had left behind. Ellie's legs ached, but she pushed through the pain, her determination unwavering. She knew they couldn't stop until they were far enough away from Black Hollow to feel safe. Eventually, they came across a small farmhouse, its chimneys smoking faintly in the distance. Ellie hesitated, a flicker of hope sparking in her chest. "Maybe they'll help us," she said, though her voice betrayed her uncertainty. They approached the farmhouse cautiously, their steps slow and deliberate. The door creaked open, and an elderly woman peered out, her eyes narrowing as she studied them. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice sharp but not unkind. Ellie took a deep breath, trying to force a smile. "We're travelers," she said. "We've been on the road for days, and we need a place to rest." The woman hesitated, her eyes flicking between Ellie and Thomas. Then, she sighed and stepped aside. "Come in," she said. "But don't cause any trouble." Inside, the farmhouse was warm and inviting, the smell of fresh bread wafting through the air. Ellie and Thomas sat at the kitchen table, their bodies aching but their spirits lifted by the kindness of the woman. She introduced herself as Martha and set a plate of bread and cheese in front of them. "Eat," she said, her tone firm but not unkind. Ellie and Thomas didn't need to be told twice. They ate in silence, the bread warm and comforting, and for the first time in days, Ellie felt a sense of peace. Martha watched them carefully, her eyes sharp but not unkind. "You two look like you've been through hell," she said, her voice quiet. Ellie hesitated, then nodded. "We have," she said, her voice trembling. Martha sighed and poured them each a cup of tea. "What happened?" she asked, her tone gentle. Ellie and Thomas exchanged a glance, unsure of how much to say. Finally, Ellie took a deep breath and began to tell Martha about Black Hollow and the horrors they had faced. Martha listened in silence, her expression growing more serious with every word. When Ellie finished, Martha sat back in her chair, her face pale with shock. "Nix," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I've heard the name before, in old stories. But I never thought—" Her voice trailed off, and she shook her head. Ellie felt a pang of fear. "You know about Nix?" she asked, her voice trembling. Martha nodded, her expression grim. "Legends say she was a goddess of darkness, banished long ago by those who feared her power. But if she's returned—" Her voice trailed off again, and Ellie's heart sank. If Nix's influence was spreading, they were in more danger than she had realized. Martha leaned forward, her eyes filled with a mix of fear and determination. "You must be careful," she said. "If Nix's influence is spreading, you could be walking into more danger." Ellie nodded, though her heart was heavy with the weight of Martha's words. She had hoped they could leave the darkness behind, but now she realized it might follow them wherever they went. "What should we do?" she asked, her voice trembling. Martha hesitated, then said, "There's a man I know, an old friend who studies ancient texts. He might be able to help you." Ellie's heart leaped with hope. "Where can we find him?" she asked, her voice urgent. Martha stood and walked to a desk in the corner of the room, rummaging through a drawer until she found a piece of paper. She wrote down an address and handed it to Ellie. "His name is Dr. Elias Grayson," she said. "He lives in the city. If anyone can help you, it's him." Ellie took the paper, her hands trembling with gratitude. "Thank you," she said, her voice filled with emotion. Martha nodded, though her expression was still grim. "Be careful," she said. "The world is more dangerous than you know." Ellie and Thomas stayed the night at Martha's farmhouse, their bodies finally getting the rest they desperately needed. The next morning, they set out again, their steps lighter but their hearts heavy with the knowledge of what lay ahead. The road to the city was long, but Ellie felt a flicker of hope as they walked. "Do you think Dr. Grayson can help us?" Thomas asked, his voice quiet. Ellie nodded, though she wasn't entirely sure herself. "He's our best chance," she said. "We have to try." As they walked, Ellie's mind wandered back to Black Hollow and everything she had lost. She had come to the town searching for answers, but she had found something far darker and more dangerous than she could have imagined. Now, she was on a new mission to stop Nyx's influence from spreading any further. It was a daunting task, but Ellie knew she couldn't give up. She had seen the darkness that Nyx was capable of, and she couldn't let it consume the world. The city came into view as they crested a hill, its skyline towering in the distance. Ellie felt a mix of excitement and fear as they approached. The city was vast and unfamiliar, a place where they could easily get lost. But it was also their best chance of finding Dr. Grayson and getting the answers they needed. "We'll find him," Ellie said, her voice firm with determination. Thomas nodded, though his expression was still grim. "We'll find him," he echoed. Together. The city loomed before them, its towering buildings casting long shadows in the late afternoon light. Ellie and Thomas stood at the edge of the bustling streets, their hearts pounding with a mix of excitement and trepidation. The noise of the city was overwhelming, car horns blaring, people shouting, and the constant hum of activity. Ellie clutched the piece of paper Martha had given her, the address of Dr. Elias Grayson etched in her mind. "We need to find him," she said, her voice firm. Thomas nodded, though his eyes were wide with unease. "Let's hope he's willing to help." They made their way through the crowded streets, their steps slow but determined as they navigated the unfamiliar city. The buildings seemed to close in around them, the sheer size of the city overwhelming after the quiet isolation of Black Hollow. Ellie felt a pang of anxiety as she realized how easy it would be to get lost here. But she pushed the thought aside, her focus fixed on finding Dr. Grayson. "We'll find him," she whispered, more to herself than to Thomas. She needed the reassurance as much as he did. After hours of searching, they finally found the building, a small, unassuming brick structure tucked between two larger ones. The sign above the door read, "Grayson Antiquities." Ellie's heart leaped with hope as she pushed the door open, a bell jingling softly as they stepped inside. The shop was cluttered with ancient artifacts and dusty books, the air thick with the scent of old paper and incense. A man stood behind the counter, his glasses perched on the end of his nose as he studied an old manuscript. He looked up as they entered, his eyes sharp but not unkind. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice calm and measured. Ellie stepped forward, her hands trembling as she handed him the piece of paper. "Are you Dr. Elias Grayson?" she asked, her voice trembling. The man nodded, his expression curious. "I am," he said. "And who might you be?" Ellie took a deep breath, trying to steady her nerves. "My name is Ellie, and this is Thomas. We need your help." Dr. Grayson studied them for a moment, then gestured for them to sit. "Please, tell me what's going on." Ellie and Thomas sat down, their exhaustion evident as they began to recount everything that had happened in Black Hollow. They told him about Seraphine, the tome of Nyx, and the horrors they had faced. Dr. Grayson listened in silence, his expression growing more serious with every word. When they finished, he leaned back in his chair, his face pale with shock. "Nyx," he whispered, his voice trembling. "I thought she was nothing but a myth, a story to frighten children. But if what you're saying is true..." "It's true," Ellie said, her voice firm. "We saw her. We fought her. And we barely survived." Dr. Grayson nodded, though his expression was still grim. "If Nyx has returned, the world is in grave danger," he said. "Her influence could spread far beyond Black Hollow, twisting minds and corrupting souls." Ellie felt a pang of fear as she realized the full extent of what they were facing. But she also felt a flicker of hope. Dr. Grayson seemed to know more about Nyx than anyone else they had met. Maybe he could help them. "What can we do?" Thomas asked, his voice trembling. Dr. Grayson hesitated, then stood and walked to a bookshelf, pulling down an ancient-looking tome. "This," he said, placing the book on the table, "is the Liber Noctis, an ancient text that speaks of Nyx and her power. It's one of the few surviving records of her existence." Ellie's heart raced as she reached for the book, her fingers brushing against its weathered cover. "Does it say how to stop her?" she asked, her voice urgent. Dr. Grayson nodded, though his expression was grim. According to the Liber Noctis, Nyx can only be defeated by uniting the three sacred relics: the Chalice of Dawn, the Sword of Eternus, and the Crown of Light. Ellie's heart sank as she realized the enormity of the task. "Where do we find them?" she asked, her voice trembling. Dr. Grayson sighed. The relics were scattered centuries ago, hidden to keep them from falling into the wrong hands. "Finding them will not be easy," Ellie nodded, though her determination was unwavering. "We'll find them," she said. "We have to." Thomas looked at Ellie, his face pale but determined. "Where do we start?" he asked. Dr. Grayson hesitated, then said, "The Chalice of Dawn is said to be hidden in the ruins of an ancient temple, deep in the mountains. The journey will be dangerous, but if you're serious about stopping Nyx, it's the first step." Ellie nodded, her heart racing with a mix of fear and determination. "We'll leave at dawn," she said. Dr. Grayson placed a hand on her shoulder, his expression filled with both fear and hope. "Be careful," he said. "The darkness will do everything it can to stop you." As the sun began to set, Ellie and Thomas prepared for their journey, their hearts heavy with the weight of what lay ahead. Dr. Grayson gave them supplies: food, water, and a map of the mountains, and wished them luck. "You're braver than most," he said, his voice filled with admiration. Ellie felt a flicker of pride, though it was quickly overshadowed by fear. "We'll stop her," she said, her voice firm, "no matter what it takes." The next morning, they set out for the mountains, their steps slow but steady as they left the city behind. The road ahead was long and treacherous, but Ellie knew they couldn't turn back. Nyx's influence was spreading, and if they didn't stop her, the world would fall into darkness. "Are you ready?" Thomas asked, his voice quiet. Ellie nodded, though her heart was pounding. "We'll find the relics," she said, "and we'll stop her. Together." As they walked, Ellie felt a flicker of hope despite the darkness that lay ahead. They had faced Nyx once and survived. They could do it again. The road ahead would be long and difficult, but Ellie was ready. She had lost so much, but she had also found strength she didn't know she had. And she had Thomas by her side. Together, they would face whatever came next. The world depended on it. The Miller family had never imagined that their lives would take such an unexpected turn. It all began with a letter from a lawyer, crisply typed on heavy parchment paper, informing them of the inheritance of Blackwood Manor. The house, nestled deep in the woods of a small New England town in Massachusetts, had belonged to a distant uncle they barely remembered. Karen Miller, the mother, saw it as a chance to start fresh after years of financial struggles. David, her husband, was more hesitant, but the idea of a new beginning in a grand old house was too tempting to ignore. Even Emily, their teenage daughter, found herself intrigued, though her younger brother, Liam, seemed indifferent, more interested in his video games than the prospect of moving. The drive to the manor was long and winding, the roads narrowing as they ventured deeper into the forest. The trees seemed to close in on them, their branches twisted and gnarled like skeletal fingers. The air grew colder as they approached the estate, and the sky darkened prematurely, though it was only midday. When they finally arrived, the sight of Blackwood Manor was both awe-inspiring and unsettling. The house loomed over them, its Gothic architecture imposing and foreboding. Its weathered stone walls were covered in ivy, and the windows, some broken, seemed to stare out like hollow eyes. Even the air around the house felt heavier, as if it carried the weight of unseen secrets. The interior of the house was no less intimidating. The front creaked open to reveal a grand foyer, its walls lined with dusty portraits of stern-faced ancestors. The floorboards groaned under their feet, and the air smelled of mildew and something faintly metallic, like old blood. To their left was a parlor filled with antique furniture, all covered in white sheets that made the room look like a graveyard of forgotten belongings. But what caught their attention immediately was the collection of marionettes. Dozens of them were displayed on shelves, hung from the ceiling, and perched on furniture, their painted faces frozen in eerie smiles or unsettling frowns. Liam, despite his initial disinterest, was immediately drawn to the marionettes. He approached one, a clown with a wide, toothy grin, and reached out to touch it, ignoring his mother's warning. The puppet's wooden head tilted slightly as he picked it up, its glassy eyes reflecting the dim light from the windows. Emily, on the other hand, felt a chill run down her spine. There was something about the way the marionettes seemed to watch them, their painted eyes following their every movement. She stayed close to her parents, her arms crossed tightly over her chest as if to shield herself from the oppressive atmosphere. Karen tried to lighten the mood, suggesting they explore the rest of the house to see what they'd inherited. David agreed, though his voice lacked the usual confidence. They climbed the grand staircase, its wooden steps creaking ominously under their weight. Upstairs, they found bedrooms filled with more dusty furniture and old, moth-eaten curtains. One room, however, stood out. It was smaller than the others, with walls covered in faded wallpaper that once might have been colorful but now looked sickly and stained. In the center of the room was a lone marionette, a ballerina with a cracked face, its arms posed delicately as if frozen mid-dance. Emily couldn't shake the feeling that the ballerina was watching her. She turned away, her heart pounding, and suggested they check the basement next. Karen nodded, though she seemed distracted, her gaze lingering on the marionette a moment too long. The basement was accessed through a narrow door in the kitchen, its hinges rusted and stiff. David forced it open with a grunt, revealing a steep set of stairs that descended into darkness. The smell that wafted up from below was foul, like something long dead had been left to rot. Emily hesitated, but David insisted they take a look, flipping on a flashlight he'd brought from the car. The basement was a cluttered mess of old furniture, broken tools, and more marionettes. Some were stacked in crates, while others hung from the ceiling, their strings tangled together like a spider's web. Liam ran ahead, his excitement uncontained, but Karen and Emily stayed close to David, their footsteps cautious. In the far corner of the room, they found something that made them all freeze, a marionette that looked exactly like Elias Blackwood, the original owner of the house. Its face was meticulously carved, its features lifelike but unnaturally still. The marionette's head tilted slightly as they approached, though no one had touched it. Karen backed away, her hand pressed to her mouth. "This place, it's not right," she whispered. David tried to reassure her, but even he looked shaken. Emily, however, couldn't take her eyes off the marionette. It felt like it was staring directly at her, its expression almost mocking. She grabbed her brother's arm and pulled him back, urging him to stay close. The family quickly retreated from the basement, the air growing colder the further they went. Back upstairs, Karen suggested they stay in town for the night and return in the morning to start cleaning. David agreed, and they all hurried out of the house, the weight of its oppressive atmosphere lifting slightly as they stepped outside. The drive to the nearest motel was quiet, each of them lost in their own thoughts. Emily stared out the window, her mind racing with questions she couldn't answer. The marionettes, the house, and the disturbing basement, it all felt like a nightmare waiting to unfold. That night, Emily couldn't sleep. The motel room was small and stuffy, but it was better than the suffocating silence of Blackwood Manor. She lay awake, her mind replaying the day's events. The way the marionettes seemed to move when no one was looking, the way the house seemed to breathe, the way the marionette of Elias Blackwood had stared at her, it all felt too real to be just her imagination. She turned to look at Liam, who was fast asleep in the bed beside hers, and wondered if he felt it too. The next morning, the family returned to the house, determined to make it their home despite the unease that clung to them like a second skin. They cleaned and dusted, trying to make the house habitable, but the marionettes were always there, watching silently from their perches. Liam continued to play with them, much to Emily's dismay, while Karen and David focused on the practical aspects of moving in. It wasn't until that evening, when the family gathered in the parlor for dinner, that something finally happened. As they ate, a soft creaking sound filled the room. They all froze, their forks halfway to their mouths. The sound came again, louder this time, and they turned to see one of the marionettes, a jester with a twisted grin, slowly turning its head to face them. Its arms rose, the strings moving on their own, and its painted mouth seemed to stretch into a wider, more sinister smile. Emily screamed, dropping her fork, and the family scrambled back from the table. The marionette's head tilted, its glassy eyes gleaming in the dim light, and then it went still, as if nothing had happened. Karen insisted they leave immediately, dragging Liam and Emily to the car despite David's protests. She drove them back to the motel, her hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white. David followed in their other car, his face pale and drawn. That night, Emily dreamt of the marionettes. They surrounded her, their strings tangling together like a web, their painted faces twisted into grotesque expressions. But the dream that haunted her most was the one where she saw herself as a marionette, her strings being pulled by an unseen hand. By the time they returned to the house the next day, Emily knew something was wrong. The marionettes seemed to have moved again, their positions subtly different from the day before. The jester in the parlor was now facing the door, its arms raised as if in greeting. Liam ran ahead, eager to play with them, but Emily stayed close to her parents, her heart pounding in her chest. The house seemed darker, its atmosphere heavier, and as they stepped inside, the front door slammed shut behind them, trapping them in the suffocating silence. Karen reached for the door handle, but it wouldn't budge. David tried next, but even his strength wasn't enough to open it. The family stood in the foyer, the marionettes watching them silently from their perches, their painted faces frozen in eerie smiles. Emily felt a chill run down her spine as she realized they weren't alone. The house had been waiting for them, and whatever was inside it had no intention of letting them leave. The faint sound of strings being pulled echoed through the house, and the marionettes began to move. The Miller family stood frozen in the foyer, the sound of their breathing the only thing breaking the oppressive silence. The marionettes on the shelves and walls began to twitch, their limbs jerking unnaturally as if invisible hands were pulling their strings. The jester in the parlor was the first to fully come to life, its arms rising and its head tilting toward them with a grotesque grin. Liam let out a shriek, clutching his mother's leg, while Emily backed away until she bumped into the wall, her wide eyes fixed on the unnatural spectacle. David stepped forward, his voice trembling as he demanded that whatever was doing this show itself. The only response was the creaking of strings and the soft, rhythmic tapping of wooden limbs against the floor. Karen grabbed Liam's hand and pulled him toward the door, shouting for David and Emily to follow. They yanked on the door handle together, but it was as if the house itself was holding it shut. The wood groaned under their efforts, but the door refused to budge. Behind them, the marionettes began to climb down from their shelves, their movements jerky but deliberate. The sound of their wooden feet tapping against the floor echoed through the house, growing louder as they advanced. Emily screamed as one of them, a soldier with a cracked face and a bayonet, lunged toward her, its movements unervingly fluid despite its rigid body. David grabbed a nearby candlestick and swung it at the soldier marionette, shattering its head into splinters. The body crumpled to the floor, but the others continued to advance, their painted eyes fixed on the family. Karen grabbed the candlestick from David and swung at a ballerina marionette that was crawling across the ceiling, its strings tangled in the chandelier. The marionette fell to the ground, its limbs snapping in unnatural directions, but it didn't stop moving. Emily grabbed Liam's hand and pulled him toward the stairs, her heart pounding so loudly she could barely think. The house seemed alive, each creak and groan of the floorboards adding to the cacophony of terror. As they ran up the stairs, the marionettes followed, their strings dragging behind them like spiderwebs. Karen and David stayed at the bottom, trying to fend them off, but the sheer number of marionettes was overwhelming. Emily and Liam reached the top of the stairs and ran down the hallway, but the door to the room they had chosen as theirs slammed shut in front of them. Emily tried the handle, but it was locked. She pounded on the door, screaming for help, but the sound of strings creaking behind her made her turn around. The marionette of Elias Blackwood stood at the end. The marionette took a step forward, its strings moving on their own, and Emily felt her breath catch in her throat. Liam began to cry, clutching her arm, and she searched desperately for a way to escape. The hallway seemed to stretch endlessly, the walls closing in as the marionette advanced. Emily grabbed a vase from a nearby table and hurled it at the marionette, shattering it into pieces. The wooden limbs scattered across the floor, but the head rolled toward them, its eyes still gleaming with malice. Emily kicked it away and grabbed Liam's hand again, pulling him down the stairs as the marionettes closed in. Karen and David were still fighting off the marionettes in the foyer, their faces pale and sweat dripping from their brows. The moment Emily and Liam reached them, Karen shouted for them to follow her to the kitchen. They ran through the house, the marionettes chasing them like a swarm of insects, their wooden limbs clicking and clacking against the floor. The kitchen was a mess of overturned chairs and broken dishes, but Karen led them to the pantry, where they barricaded themselves inside. The sound of the marionettes scratching at the door was deafening, and Liam buried his face in his hands, sobbing uncontrollably. David leaned against the door, his chest heaving, and looked at Karen with desperation in his eyes. "What the hell is going on?" he shouted, his voice breaking. Karen shook her head, tears streaming down her face as she held Liam close. Emily stood in the corner, her arms wrapped around herself, trying to block out the sound of the marionettes. The pantry was small and cramped, and the air felt thick with fear. The scratching at the door grew louder, and Emily could hear the sound of wood splintering as the marionettes tried to break through. Suddenly, the scratching stopped. The pantry fell silent, the only sound the ragged breathing of the family. Emily exchanged a nervous glance with her parents, her heart still racing. After what felt like an eternity, David cautiously opened the pantry door and peeked out. The kitchen was empty, the marionettes gone. The house was eerily quiet, the only sound the faint hum of the wind outside. David stepped out of the pantry, holding the candlestick like a weapon, and signaled for the others to follow. Karen and Liam stayed close to him, while Emily lingered behind, her eyes darting around the room. The foyer was empty, the marionettes back on their shelves as if nothing had happened. The family stood in stunned silence, their eyes fixed on the wooden figures. Liam whimpered and buried his face in Karen's shoulder, while David clenched his fists, his jaw tight with anger. Emily felt a chill run down her spine as she noticed that the marionettes were facing them, their painted eyes gleaming in the dim light. The jester's grin seemed wider, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. The house felt different now, as if it were watching them, waiting for its next move. Karen broke the silence, her voice trembling. "We need to get out of here. Now." David nodded, but as they turned toward the door, it slammed shut again, the sound echoing through the house like a gunshot. Emily screamed, and the marionettes began to twitch, their strings creaking as they came to life once more. The family backed away, their faces pale with terror, as the marionettes climbed down from their shelves and advanced toward them. The jester led the way, its grin widening as it lifted its arms, its strings moving on their own. The ballerina followed, its cracked face tilted to the side, its limbs jerking unnaturally. Emily felt a strange pull in her chest, as if something inside her was responding to the marionettes. She looked down at her hands and gasped as she saw faint strings attached to her fingers, glowing faintly in the dim light. The strings stretched upward, disappearing into the shadows of the ceiling, and Emily felt a surge of panic. She tried to pull her hands away, but the strings tightened, forcing her fingers to move against her will. She screamed, and her parents turned to see what was happening. Their eyes widened with horror as they saw the strings attached to Emily, pulling her toward the marionettes. Karen lunged forward, trying to grab her daughter, but the marionettes swarmed around her, their wooden limbs blocking her path. David swung the candlestick at them, but it was no use. The marionettes were relentless, their movements unerringly coordinated. Emily's arms rose into the air, her fingers twitching as if she were controlling the marionettes. The connection between her and the wooden figures grew stronger, and she felt a strange awareness of their thoughts, their intentions. The house wasn't just alive, it was using her, feeding on her fear and desperation. The jester marionette stepped forward, its grin widening as it reached out to touch Emily's face. She flinched, but the strings forced her to stay still, her body trembling with terror. The marionette's wooden hand brushed against her cheek, and she felt a surge of energy, as if the house was draining her life force. Karen screamed, breaking through the swarm of marionettes and grabbing Emily's arm. The strings snapped, and Emily fell to the ground, gasping for breath. The marionettes turned their attention to Karen, their movements becoming more aggressive, and David pulled her back, shielding her with his body. The family huddled together, their backs against the wall, as the marionettes closed in. The jester grinned, its head tilting to the side, and the ballerina lifted its arms, its strings tangling together like a web. Emily's breath came in short, panicked gasps, and she clutched her mother's hand tightly. The house seemed to hum with energy, the air thick with malice, and the marionettes moved in unison, their wooden limbs clicking and clacking as they prepared to strike. Just as they were about to attack, the sound of a door creaking open echoed through the house, and the marionettes froze, their heads turning toward the source of the noise. The family didn't wait to find out what it was. They grabbed each other's hands and ran toward the door, their hearts pounding with fear. The Millers burst out of the house, the cool night air hitting their faces like a slap. They ran across the overgrown yard, their feet crunching on dead leaves and twigs, not stopping until they reached their car. David fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking so badly he could barely unlock the door. Karen helped Liam into the back seat while Emily climbed in beside him, her chest heaving with panic. The moment the car started, David sped down the dirt driveway, the headlights cutting through the darkness as they left Blackwood Manor behind. None of them spoke, the weight of what had just happened hanging heavy in the air. They drove to the motel in silence, the only sound the hum of the car engine and the occasional sniffle from Liam. Karen kept glancing over her shoulder, as if expecting to see the marionettes following them, but the road behind them remained empty. When they finally arrived at the motel, Karen hurriedly booked a room, her hands still trembling as she handed over her credit card. The room was small and shabby, but it felt like a sanctuary after what they had endured. They all collapsed onto the beds, too exhausted to speak, though sleep wouldn't come easily. Emily lay awake long after her parents and brother had fallen asleep, her mind racing with questions. The strings that had attached themselves to her hands, what were they? Why had the house chosen her? She stared at the ceiling, replaying the moment she'd felt that strange pull in her chest, the surge of energy when the marionette had touched her. It was as if the house had been trying to possess her, to make her a part of its twisted game. She shivered, pulling the thin motel blanket tighter around her, and vowed never to go back. But deep down, she knew it wasn't that simple. The next morning, the family gathered in the motel's small dining area, the somber atmosphere contrasting sharply with the cheerful decor. David pushed his coffee around with a spoon, his face drawn and pale, while Karen stared out the window, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. Liam poked at his pancakes, his usual appetite gone. Emily sat beside him, her hands wrapped around a mug of hot chocolate, though she hadn't taken a sip. Finally, David broke the silence, his voice low and urgent. "We need to figure out what's going on. That house, it's not just haunted. It's alive." Karen nodded, her eyes wide with fear. "We can't just leave it like this. What if someone else moves in? What if it waits for us to come back?" Her voice trailed off, and she looked at Emily, her expression filled with worry. Emily avoided her gaze, staring down at her hands as if she could still see the faint outlines of the strings. David suggested they go to the local library to research the history of Blackwood Manor. It was the only lead they had, and they couldn't ignore it. Reluctantly, the family agreed, though none of them wanted to return to that house. The library was a small, brick building in the center of town, its shelves crammed with dusty old books and fading newspapers. The librarian, An elderly woman with glasses perched on the end of her nose eyed them curiously as they entered. David approached her and explained that they were researching the history of Blackwood Manor. The librarian's expression darkened, and she hesitated before directing them to a section on local history. As she walked away, Emily noticed her whispering to another librarian, their eyes flicking toward the Millers with unease. They spent hours combing through old newspapers and books, but the information they found only deepened their unease. Blackwood Manor had been built in the mid-1800s by Elias Blackwood, a renowned puppeteer who had gained fame for his macabre marionette shows. The articles described his creations as disturbingly lifelike and hinted at rumors of occult practices. One article from the 1920s detailed the disappearances of several children in the area, though no connection to Blackwood had ever been proven. Another mentioned that the house had remained abandoned after Blackwood's mysterious death in 1934, with several failed attempts to sell or renovate it. Emily found a journal entry written by a local historian, detailing a visit to the house in the 1950s. The historian described encountering unnatural phenomena, including marionettes that moved on their own and the sound of strings being pulled in empty rooms. He concluded that the house was cursed, its malevolent energy tied to Blackwood's obsession with immortality. Emily read the passage aloud to her family, her voice shaking as she reached the final line. The house is not merely a structure, it is a vessel for Blackwood's soul, and it seeks to claim new victims to sustain itself. Karen's face paled, and she grabbed the journal from Emily, reading the passage again as if hoping she'd misunderstood. David clenched his fists, his jaw tight with anger, while Liam stared at the words, his eyes wide with fear. The more they read, the clearer it became they weren't dealing with a simple haunting. Blackwood Manor was a trap, and they had walked right into it. The marionettes weren't just puppets, they were conduits for the house's malevolent energy, tools used to manipulate and possess its victims. The librarian returned with a folder of old photographs, her expression solemn. "I thought you might want to see these," she said, handing it to David. Inside were photos of the house throughout the years, its grandeur fading as it fell into disrepair. One photo, however, stood out. It was a group portrait of Elias Blackwood standing in front of his marionettes, their painted faces eerily lifelike. Blackwood's expression was cold and calculating, his eyes seeming to pierce through the photograph. Emily felt a chill run down her spine as she realized one of the marionettes in the photo was the jester from the parlor, its grin identical to the one she'd seen the night before. David closed the folder and looked at his family, his expression grim. "We need to go back. We can't just leave it like this. We have to stop whatever's in that house before it hurts someone else." Karen opened her mouth to protest, but Emily nodded in agreement. As terrifying as the idea was, she knew they had no choice. The house had already marked her, and if they didn't confront it, the consequences could be catastrophic. Liam clung to Karen, his small frame trembling, but he didn't argue. He'd seen enough to know they couldn't ignore the danger. As they left the library, the weight of their task settled over them like a heavy blanket. The house was waiting for them, its malevolent energy growing stronger with each passing moment. Emily could feel it, a faint tug in her chest that made her wonder if the strings were still attached. The drive back to Blackwood Manor was silent, the tension in the car almost unbearable. When they arrived, the house loomed before them, its dark windows like empty eye sockets. The marionettes were waiting, their painted faces twisted into grotesque smiles, and the family knew they were about to face their worst nightmare. The house wasn't just alive, it was hungry, and it had no intention of letting them leave again. The Miller family stood at the edge of the property, staring up at Blackwood Manor with a mixture of dread and determination. The house seemed larger in the daylight, its Gothic spires piercing the gray sky like jagged teeth. The windows reflected the sunlight, giving the illusion that the house was watching them, waiting for them to step inside. David held a duffel bag filled with tools they'd gathered from the motel flashlights, a hammer, a crowbar, and a can of lighter fluid they'd bought at a gas station. Karen clutched a small vial of holy water she'd picked up from the town's church, though she wasn't sure if it would work. Emily held Liam's hand tightly, Her other hand clenched into a fist as she tried to ignore the faint tug in her chest. They walked up the overgrown path to the front door, their footsteps crunching on the dead leaves. The door was slightly ajar, as if the house was inviting them in. David pushed it open slowly, the hinges creaking like a scream. The foyer was eerily silent, the marionettes on their shelves unmoving. The jester in the parlor stood with its arms raised, its grin wide and mocking. The family stepped inside cautiously, the air heavy with the scent of mildew and something metallic, like old blood. The moment the door creaked shut behind them, the atmosphere shifted, and the marionettes began to twitch, their strings creaking as they came to life. "Stay close," David whispered, his voice barely audible over the sound of their nervous breathing. The marionettes on the shelves began to climb down, their movements jerky but deliberate. The jester led the way, its head tilting unnaturally as it advanced toward them. Karen held up the vial of holy water, her hands shaking as she splashed some on the jester. It hissed and recoiled, its painted face contorting in pain, but it didn't stop. The ballerina crawled across the ceiling, its strings tangled in the chandelier, while the soldier marionette lunged at David with its bayonet. He swung the crowbar, shattering its head into splinters, but the body kept moving. Emily felt the tug in her chest grow stronger, and she looked down to see faint strings attached to her hands again. They glowed faintly, stretching upward into the shadows of the ceiling. She tried to pull her hands away, but the strings tightened, forcing her fingers to move against her will. Her arms rose into the air, her fingers twitching as if she were controlling the marionettes. The connection between her and the house grew stronger, and she felt a surge of panic as she realized the house was using her, feeding on her fear. Karen grabbed her shoulders, shaking her until the strings snapped and Emily fell to the floor, gasping for breath. The marionettes advanced, their movements more aggressive now, and the family backed away into the parlor. David swung the crowbar wildly, shattering the marionettes as they came closer, but it was like fighting a swarm. The more he destroyed, the more seemed to appear, crawling out of the shadows and falling from the ceiling. Karen splashed holy water on them, but there was too little to be effective. Emily scrambled to her feet, her eyes darting around the room for something they could use. She spotted an old book on a nearby table, Elias Blackwood's journal. She grabbed it, flipping through the pages frantically until she found a passage about the ritual he used to bind his soul to the house. "We need to destroy the marionettes in a specific order," she shouted, her voice trembling. "The journal says the jester, the ballerina, the soldier, and the clown. That's the order we have to follow." David nodded, swinging the crowbar at the jester again as it lunged toward them. This time, when he shattered its head, the body crumpled to the floor and didn't move. Karen grabbed the can of lighter fluid and poured it over the jester's remains, then lit a match and dropped it. The flames consumed the marionette, its painted face melting into a grotesque puddle. The ballerina crawled across the ceiling, its cracked face twisted into a snarl. David and Karen worked together to knock it down, and Emily grabbed the hammer, smashing it into pieces. Karen doused it in lighter fluid and set it ablaze, the flames licking at the ceiling. The soldier marionette was next, its bayonet swinging wildly as David shattered its head with the crowbar. Emily kicked the pieces into the fireplace, and Karen lit the fire, watching as the marionette burned to ash. The family turned their attention to the clown, which stood in the corner of the room, its wide grin filled with malice. The clown was the most powerful of the marionettes, its strings glowing faintly as it advanced toward them. Emily felt the tug in her chest again and realized the house was struggling to maintain its control. "It's trying to stop us," she shouted, grabbing the hammer and swinging it at the clown. The head cracked but didn't shatter, and the clown grabbed the hammer, wrenching it from her hands. David swung the crowbar, smashing its arms and legs, but it kept moving, its painted eyes gleaming with hatred. Karen grabbed the vial of holy water, splashing the rest of it on the clown, and it screeched, its face contorting in pain. Emily grabbed the hammer again and smashed the clown's head, the wood splintering into pieces. Karen doused it in lighter fluid and set it on fire, the flames consuming the last of the marionettes. The house seemed to shudder, the walls creaking and groaning as if in pain. The faint strings attached to Emily's hands snapped, and she collapsed to the floor, gasping for breath. The tug in her chest was gone, but the house wasn't finished. The walls began to bleed, dark rivulets of liquid oozing down the wallpaper, and the floorboards buckled and cracked. The family ran toward the door, but it wouldn't budge. The house was collapsing around them, its malevolent energy fighting to survive. David grabbed the crowbar and started prying at the door, his muscles straining. Karen and Emily joined him, their combined strength finally forcing the door open. They ran outside, the house groaning and shuddering behind them, and didn't stop until they reached the edge of the property. When they turned back, Blackwood Manor was engulfed in flames, the fire consuming the structure as if it were alive. The marionettes were gone, their strings reduced to ash, but the family knew it wasn't over. The house was destroyed, but its darkness lingered, waiting for the next family to fall into its trap. The flames roared into the night sky, casting an eerie glow over the forest surrounding Blackwood Manor. The Miller family stood at a safe distance, their faces illuminated by the fire's orange light. Emily clutched her mother's hand tightly, her heart still racing from the horrors they had escaped. The house groaned and creaked as it collapsed, the sound of wood splintering and glass shattering filling the air. Karen wrapped an arm around Liam, who was sobbing quietly into her side, while David stared at the flames, his expression a mix of relief and exhaustion. The fire was consuming everything: the marionettes, the house, and the dark energy that had haunted them. As the fire burned, a strange silence settled over the forest, as if the world was holding its breath. The flickering light cast long shadows on the trees, making them seem almost alive, their branches reaching out like skeletal hands. Emily couldn't help but feel a sense of unease, as if the darkness wasn't entirely gone. She glanced over her shoulder, half expecting to see the marionettes crawling out of the forest, but there was nothing but the trees and the night. The fire continued to rage, and the family watched in silence, their minds still reeling from the ordeal. After what felt like an eternity, the fire began to die down, leaving behind a smoldering ruin of what was once Blackwood Manor. The charred remains of the house seemed to sag under their own weight, the spires now jagged and broken. The air was thick with the acrid smell of smoke, and the ground was covered in ash and debris. David took a step forward, his eyes scanning the ruins, but Karen stopped him with a hand on his arm. "It's over," she whispered, though her voice lacked conviction. Emily looked at her mother, sensing the doubt in her words, but she didn't say anything. The tug in her chest was gone, but the memory of the strings lingered, like a ghostly echo. The family returned to the motel, their bodies heavy with exhaustion but their minds still on edge. The room felt like a refuge, though none of them could shake the feeling that they were being watched. Karen tucked Liam into bed, whispering soothing words to calm him, but his eyes remained wide with fear. David sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the floor, his hands clenched into fists. Emily sat by the window, staring out at the dark forest, her thoughts a jumble of fear and relief. She couldn't shake the image of the marionettes, their painted faces twisted into grotesque expressions, and the way they had moved, as if alive. The next morning, the family packed their belongings and checked out of the motel, eager to leave the town behind. The drive home was quiet, the weight of their experience hanging over them like a dark cloud. Emily stared out the window, the rolling hills and forests passing by in a blur. Her mind kept returning to the house, to the marionettes, and to the strange connection she had felt. She wondered if the house was truly gone or if it had left some part of itself behind, buried deep in her mind. The others were silent, lost in their own thoughts, the shared trauma binding them together in unspoken understanding. When they finally arrived home, the house felt strange and unfamiliar, as if they had been gone for years instead of days. Karen unpacked their belongings while David inspected the locks on the doors and windows, his vigilance unshakable. Liam clung to Emily, refusing to let her out of his sight, and she did her best to reassure him, though she wasn't sure she believed her own words. The days passed in a haze, the family trying to return to their normal lives, but the shadow of Blackwood Manor lingered, casting a pall over everything. Emily's nights were filled with nightmares of the marionettes, their strings tangling around her, pulling her into the darkness. Karen and David slept fitfully, their dreams haunted by the house and its malevolent energy. Liam often woke up screaming, his cries echoing through the house, and Karen would rush to his side, comforting him until he fell back asleep. The family tried to push the memories aside, but they were always there, lurking in the corners of their minds, waiting to resurface. One evening, as Emily was helping her mother with dinner, she noticed something strange on her hand, a faint mark, like the imprint of a string. Her breath caught in her throat, and she rubbed at the mark, but it didn't fade. She showed it to Karen, who examined it closely, her face pale with worry. "It's probably nothing," Karen said, though her voice trembled. Emily nodded, but she couldn't shake the feeling that it was a sign, a reminder that the house wasn't truly gone. The next day, Emily found another mark, this time on her arm. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it was there. She tried to ignore it, focusing on school and spending time with her friends, but the marks kept appearing, each one slightly darker than the last. She didn't tell her parents, not wanting to worry them, but the fear grew with each new mark. The tug in her chest was gone, but the string seemed to have left something behind, something that was slowly taking root. Emily began to feel a strange pull, as if the house was calling to her, even though it was gone. She would find herself staring at the forest behind their house, her mind wandering back to Blackwood Manor. The nightmares grew worse, the marionettes becoming more vivid and lifelike, and she often woke up with the feeling that she was being watched. She tried to push the thoughts aside, but they were always there, lurking in the back of her mind. One night, Emily woke up to the sound of tapping on her window. She sat up in bed, her heart pounding, and turned to see the jester marionette standing outside, its painted face twisted into a grotesque grin. She screamed, and the marionette vanished, leaving only the dark forest behind the glass. Karen and David rushed into her room, their faces pale with fear, but by the time they arrived, the marionette was gone. Emily tried to explain what she had seen, but the words felt hollow, and her parents exchanged worried glances. The next morning, Emily found a marionette, a clown with a wide, toothy grin sitting on her desk. She stared at it in horror, her hands trembling as she picked it up. The wood was smooth and warm to the touch, and the painted eyes seemed to gleam with malice. She threw it on the floor, shattering it into pieces. But the head rolled toward her, its grin widening. She backed away, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps, and ran to find her parents. Karen and David tried to reassure her, but the fear in their eyes was unmistakable. They searched the house, checking every room and corner, but there was no sign of the marionettes. The family sat together in the living room, the tension palpable, and Emily felt the tug in her chest again, faint but undeniable. The house wasn't gone, it was calling to her, pulling her back. The marionettes were gone, but the darkness remained, and it had chosen her. The strings were still attached, pulling her into the shadows, and she knew there was no escape. The nightmare had only just begun. Emily sat in the living room, clutching a blanket around her shoulders, her eyes fixed on the shattered pieces of the clown marionette. Karen and David were pacing the room, their faces pale and drawn, while Liam sat silently on the couch, his small frame trembling. The air was heavy with tension, the silence broken only by the occasional creak of the house settling. Emily's mind raced. The image of the jester marionette outside her window burned into her memory. She wanted to believe it was a nightmare, but the shattered clown on the floor was proof that it wasn't. The nightmare was real, and it had followed them home. David grabbed his phone and called the local police, his voice shaking as he explained what had happened. The dispatcher listened patiently but suggested it might have been a prank or an animal outside the window. David insisted it wasn't either of those things, but his words fell on deaf ears. Frustrated, he hung up and turned to his family, his hands clenched into fists. "We can't just sit here and wait for something else to happen," he said, his voice low and urgent. Karen nodded, her eyes filled with determination, and they began to search the house again, this time looking for anything out of the ordinary. Emily stayed with Liam, holding his hand tightly as they watched their parents tear apart the house in search of answers. The marks on her arms seemed to pulse faintly, almost as if they were alive, and she could feel the tug in her chest growing stronger. She tried to ignore it, focusing on comforting Liam, but the fear was overwhelming. The house had chosen her, and now it was trying to pull her back. She wondered if the marionettes were still out there, waiting in the shadows, or if the marks were a sign that the house's darkness had already taken root inside her. The search yielded nothing, and the family sat together in the living room, the tension in the air almost suffocating. Emily glanced at the shattered clown marionette, its painted head staring up at her with its wide, toothy grin. She felt a surge of anger and grabbed a broom, sweeping the pieces into a trash bag and tying it tightly. Karen suggested they burn the pieces, and David agreed, leading the family outside to a small fire pit in the backyard. They watched as the flames consumed the bag, the wood crackling and popping as it burned. For a moment, Emily felt a sense of relief, but it was short-lived. As the fire died down, Emily noticed something strange. The marks on her arms were glowing faintly, the faint lines pulsing with a soft, eerie light. She showed them to her parents, and their faces filled with dread. "It's the house," Karen whispered, her voice trembling. "It's not done with you." Emily felt a surge of panic, the tug in her chest growing stronger, and she realized she couldn't ignore it any longer. The house was calling to her, and she knew she would have to answer. The thought filled her with terror, but she also felt a strange sense of inevitability, as if this was always meant to happen. The next morning, the family made a plan. They would return to the ruins of Blackwood Manor, armed with whatever they could find that might help them destroy the house's darkness once and for all. Karen packed the holy water and lighter fluid, while David gathered tools: a crowbar, a hammer, and a shovel. Emily took the lead, her determination overshadowing her fear. She had been mocked by the house, and she knew she was the key to stopping it. The thought filled her with a mix of dread and resolve, and she vowed to protect her family, no matter the cost. The drive back to Blackwood Manor was quiet, the weight of their task hanging heavy in the air. The forest seemed darker somehow, the trees taller and more menacing, as if they were closing in around them. When they arrived at the ruins, the house was nothing but a smoldering pile of ash and debris, the once grand structure reduced to rubble. The air was thick with the smell of smoke, and the ground was littered with charred wood and broken glass. Emily stepped out of the car, the tug in her chest growing stronger, and she knew they were in the right place. They searched the ruins, looking for any sign of the house's darkness, but everything seemed still and lifeless. The marks on Emily's arms continued to glow faintly, and she could feel the house's energy pulsing around her. She knelt down in the center of the ruins, her hands trembling as she pressed them to the ground. The tug in her chest intensified, and she felt a surge of energy, as if the house was trying to pull her into the earth. She closed her eyes, focusing on the feeling, and suddenly, she knew what she had to do. Emily stood and grabbed the shovel, her family watching in silence as she began to dig. The ground was hard and unyielding, but she refused to stop, her arms aching with the effort. After what felt like hours, the shovel hit something solid, and she dropped to her knees, brushing away the dirt. Beneath the ground was a wooden box, its surface carved with strange symbols. The family gathered around, their faces pale with fear, and Emily opened the box. Inside was a marionette, a perfect replica of Elias Blackwood, its painted eyes gleaming with malice. The moment the marionette was exposed, the air around them grew cold, and the ground began to tremble. The family backed away as the marionette twitched, its strings moving on their own, and Emily felt the tug in her chest become unbearable. Karen splashed holy water on the marionette, and it hissed, its wooden limbs jerking violently. David grabbed the crowbar, smashing the marionette's head into splinters, but the body kept moving, its strings tangling around Emily's legs. She screamed, kicking at the strings, but they only tightened, pulling her toward the box. Karen poured lighter fluid on the remains of the marionette and lit a match, the flames consuming the wood and strings. The ground shook violently, and the air filled with a deafening roar, as if the house was screaming in rage. The marks on Emily's arms glowed brightly, and she felt a surge of energy, as if the house was draining her life force. She collapsed to the ground, her body trembling, and Karen grabbed her, holding her tightly as the flames consumed the box and the marionette. The ground stopped shaking, and the air grew still, the house's darkness finally defeated. The family sat together in the ruins, their bodies heavy with exhaustion but their hearts filled with relief. The marks on Emily's arms had faded, and the tug in her chest was gone. The house's darkness had been destroyed, and with it, the marionettes that had haunted them. They sat in silence, the weight of their ordeal lifting, and for the first time in weeks, they felt at peace. The nightmare was over, and they could finally move on, leaving the shadows of Blackwood Manor behind. The road ahead would be long, but they would face it together, stronger than ever. The sun was setting as the Miller family drove away from the ruins of Blackwood Manor, the forest fading into the distance behind them. The weight of their ordeal still hung heavily in the air, but there was a sense of relief too, a tentative hope that the nightmare was truly over. Emily sat in the back seat, staring out the window, the faint marks on her arms now completely gone. She could still feel the residual energy of the house, like an echo in her mind, but it was fading with each passing mile. Karen glanced back at her, her eyes filled with concern, but Emily gave her a small, reassuring smile. They had survived, and that was what mattered. The drive home was quiet, the exhaustion of the day catching up with them. Liam had fallen asleep in the back seat, his head resting on Emily's shoulder, and David's hands were steady on the wheel, though his face was drawn with fatigue. Karen stared out the window, her thoughts a jumble of fear and relief, as the landscape rolled by in a blur. The car's headlights cut through the growing darkness, and the road stretched ahead, leading them away from the horrors they had faced. None of them spoke, the shared trauma binding them together in unspoken understanding. When they finally arrived home, the house felt different, lighter, somehow, as if the darkness that had lingered was gone. Karen made a quick dinner, the familiar sounds of the kitchen helping to ground them in the moment. Emily helped set the table, her hands steady, and Liam sat at the table, his eyes wide as he watched his family. The meal was simple, but it felt like a feast, a celebration of their survival. They ate in silence, the weight of the past few days slowly lifting, and for the first time in weeks, they felt like a family again. After dinner, Karen ran a bath for Liam, the warm water and soothing lavender scent helping to calm him. He splashed around happily, his laughter filling the bathroom, and Karen felt a lump in her throat as she watched him. The fear in his eyes was gone, replaced by the innocent joy of a child, and she vowed to protect him, no matter what. Emily helped her mom dry Liam off and get him into his pajamas, the mundane task grounding them in the present. They tucked him into bed, Karen reading him a story until he fell asleep, his small hand clutching hers. Emily went to her room, the familiar space feeling both comforting and strange. She sat on her bed, staring at the walls, and tried to process everything that had happened. The house was gone, the darkness destroyed, but the memories lingered, like ghosts in her mind. She could still see the marionettes, their painted faces twisted into grotesque expressions, and the way they had moved, as if alive. She shook her head, trying to push the thoughts aside, but they were always there, lurking in the corners of her mind. The next morning, the sun streamed through the windows, filling the house with light. The family gathered in the kitchen for breakfast, the normalcy of the moment a stark contrast to the horrors they had faced. Karen made pancakes, the smell filling the air, and Liam chattered happily, his fear forgotten. David sipped his coffee, his face relaxed for the first time in weeks, and Emily smiled as she watched her family. They had been through something unimaginable, but they had come out the other side, stronger and more united than ever. Emily returned to school the following week, the familiar routine helping to ground her in the present. Her friends noticed something was different, but she didn't tell them what had happened, knowing they wouldn't understand. She focused on her classes, her grades improving as she threw herself into her work, and she began to feel like herself again. The memories of Blackwood Manor were still there, but they were fading, and she was determined to move forward. Karen and David returned to work, their days filled with the usual tasks, but the experience had changed them too. They were more aware of the fragility of life, the importance of family, and they made an effort to spend more time with Emily and Liam. The days turned into weeks, the weeks into months, and the horrors of Blackwood Manor became a distant memory, something they rarely spoke of but would never forget. One evening, as the family sat together in the living room, Karen brought up the idea of a vacation. "We need something to look forward to," she said, her voice filled with hope. "Somewhere warm, with a beach and lots of sunshine." Emily and Liam nodded enthusiastically, the idea of a fresh start appealing to all of them. David smiled, his eyes filled with relief, and they began to plan the trip, the excitement of something new helping to heal the wounds of the past. The vacation was everything they had hoped for, days spent on the beach, nights filled with laughter and good food, and the feeling of being a family again. Emily felt the last traces of darkness fade, replaced by the warmth of the sun and the love of her family. They built sandcastles, swam in the ocean, and explored the local town, the experience helping to create new, happy memories. The nightmare of Blackwood Manor was gone, replaced by the joy of the present. As the trip came to an end, the family packed their bags, the memories of the beach and the sun filling them with a sense of peace. The drive home was quiet, but it was a comfortable silence, the kind that comes from being together and feeling safe. They arrived home to a house that felt like a sanctuary, the shadows of the past finally gone. The family unpacked their bags, the familiar routine helping to ground them in the moment, and they knew they could handle whatever came their way. Emily sat in her room that evening, staring out the window at the stars, her heart filled with gratitude. She had faced something unimaginable, but she had survived, and she had her family to thank for that. The marks on her arms were gone, the tug in her chest a distant memory, and she felt a sense of closure, as if the nightmare was truly over. She knew they would always carry the scars of what they had been through, but they were stronger because of it, and they would face the future together. The days turned into weeks, the weeks into months, and the Miller family continued to heal. The memories of Blackwood Manor became a story they told themselves, a reminder of their strength and resilience. They made an effort to live in the present, to cherish the moments they had together, and to never take each other for granted. The house was gone, the darkness destroyed, but the lessons they had learned would stay with them forever. Emily sat in the living room one evening. Her family gathered around her, and she felt a sense of peace. The nightmare was over, and they had come out the other side, stronger and more united than ever. The future was uncertain, but they would face it together, knowing they could handle whatever came their way. The shadows of Blackwood Manor were gone, replaced by the light of their love, and they knew they would never be alone again. The autumn leaves painted the ground in a mosaic of red, orange, and gold, the crisp air carrying the faint scent of wood smoke. The Miller family had settled back into their routines, the horrors of Blackwood Manor fading into the background like a forgotten dream. Emily had started her sophomore year of high school, her days filled with classes, friends, and the occasional after-school activity. Karen and David had returned to their jobs, the rhythm of their lives steady and predictable. Liam, now in first grade, had adjusted well to school, his laughter and energy filling the house with life. Yet, despite the normalcy, there was an unspoken tension, a quiet vigilance that none of them could shake. One evening, as Emily sat at her desk finishing her homework, she noticed the faintest shadow flicker at the edge of her vision. She turned sharply, her heart skipping a beat, but there was nothing there. The room was quiet, the only sound the soft hum of her desk lamp. She shook her head, telling herself it was just her imagination, but the feeling lingered, a faint unease that she couldn't quite shake. She returned to her homework, forcing herself to focus, but the shadow seemed to linger in the corners of her mind. A few days later, Emily was walking home from school when she felt a sudden chill, the kind that made her skin crawl. She glanced over her shoulder, half expecting to see someone or something following her, but the street was empty. The leaves rustled in the wind, the sound almost like whispers, and she quickened her pace, her heart pounding. When she got home, she locked the door behind her, the familiar warmth of the house calming her nerves. She didn't mention the incident to her parents, not wanting to worry them, but the feeling of being watched didn't go away. That night, Emily had a nightmare. She was back in Blackwood Manor, the marionettes surrounding her, their strings tangling around her limbs. The jester's grin was wider than ever, its painted eyes gleaming with malice, and she could feel the darkness pulling her in, suffocating her. She woke up gasping for air, her sheets tangled around her, and the room was filled with an unnatural silence. The faint glow of the moonlight through her window seemed to cast strange shadows on the walls, and she felt the tug in her chest again, faint but unmistakable. The next morning, Emily found a marionette, a small, wooden soldier sitting on her windowsill. She stared at it in horror, her hands trembling as she reached out to pick it up. The wood was cold to the touch, the painted face unnervingly lifelike, and she felt a surge of panic. She threw it out the window, shattering it on the ground below, but the head rolled toward the house, its eyes seeming to follow her. She slammed the window shut, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps, and ran to find her parents. Karen and David tried to reassure her, but the fear in their eyes was unmistakable. They searched the house again, checking every room and corner, but there was no sign of the marionettes. The family sat together in the living room, the tension palpable, and Emily felt the tug in her chest again, faint but undeniable. The house wasn't gone, it was calling to her, pulling her back. The marionettes were gone, but the darkness remained, and it had chosen her. The strings were still attached, pulling her into the shadows, and she knew there was no escape. The nightmare had only just begun. The days passed in a blur, the unease growing with each passing hour. Emily found herself jumping at every shadow, her senses on high alert, and the nightmares became more frequent. The marionettes appeared in her dreams, their movements jerky and unnatural, and she could feel the darkness closing in around her. She tried to ignore it, focusing on school and spending time with her friends, but the fear was always there, lurking in the back of her mind. The tug in her chest grew stronger, and she realized she couldn't fight it any longer. One evening, Emily found herself standing in the backyard, the cool air biting at her skin. She didn't remember how she got there, but the marks on her arms were glowing faintly, the lines pulsing with a soft, eerie light. She could feel the house calling to her, the darkness pulling her in, and she knew she had to face it. She walked to the edge of the property, the forest stretching out before her, and she felt a surge of determination. The house had chosen her, but she would choose her family, no matter the cost. Karen and David found Emily in the backyard, her eyes fixed on the forest, and they knew something was wrong. The marks on her arms were glowing brighter than ever, and she seemed almost unaware of their presence. Karen grabbed her shoulders, shaking her gently, but Emily didn't respond. The tug in her chest was overwhelming, and she felt the darkness calling to her, pulling her in. David grabbed his phone and called for help, his voice shaking with panic, but they knew they couldn't wait. The family returned to the ruins of Blackwood Manor, the forest closing in around them as they drove. The air was thick with the scent of decay, and the trees seemed to whisper as they passed. The marks on Emily's arms were glowing brightly, and she could feel the darkness pulling her in, the tug in her chest unbearable. They arrived at the ruins, the once grand structure now a pile of ash and debris, and Emily felt a surge of energy. The house was still here, buried beneath the earth, waiting for her to return. Emily knelt down in the center of the ruins, her hands pressing against the ground, and she felt the darkness surging around her. The marks on her arms glowed brightly, the lines pulsing with energy, and she focused on the feeling, trying to push the darkness away. Karen and David watched in horror, the air around them growing colder, and they knew they had to act. David grabbed the shovel, digging into the ground with all his strength, while Karen held Emily's hand, whispering words of encouragement. David uncovered the wooden box, the same one they had found before, and the air around them grew colder. The box was filled with marionettes, their painted faces twisted into grotesque expressions, and Emily felt the tug in her chest intensify. Karen poured holy water on the box, the marionettes hissing and jerking violently, while David smashed them with the shovel. The ground shook, the air filled with a deafening roar, and the marks on Emily's arms glowed brightly. She felt a surge of energy, as if the house was draining her life force, and she fought against it, her determination unwavering. Karen lit a match, the flames consuming the box and the marionettes, and the ground stopped shaking. The air grew still, the darkness finally defeated, and the marks on Emily's arms faded. She collapsed to the ground, her body trembling, and Karen held her tightly, whispering words of comfort. The house was gone, the darkness destroyed, and the family was together. They sat in silence, the weight of their ordeal lifting, and for the first time in weeks, they felt at peace. The nightmare was over, and they would face the future together, stronger than ever. The weeks following their return from the ruins of Blackwood Manor were marked by a fragile calm. The Miller family moved through their days cautiously, as though afraid to disturb the delicate peace they had fought so hard to achieve. Emily's nightmares had stopped, and the marks on her arms were gone, though she still caught herself glancing over her shoulder sometimes, half expecting to see something lurking in the shadows. Karen and David were vigilant, checking the locks on the doors and windows every night, their anxiety slowly ebbing but not entirely gone. Liam, too, seemed to sense the lingering unease, often clinging to Emily or Karen when the sun dipped below the horizon and the house grew quiet. One crisp afternoon, Emily and Liam were playing in the backyard, the cool autumn air sharp and invigorating. Leaves had blanketed the ground, and they were building a fort out of sticks and fallen branches, laughing as they worked. But then Liam stopped suddenly, his small face pale as he stared at something in the woods. Emily followed his gaze, her heart sinking when she saw a figure standing just beyond the tree line. It was indistinct, a shadowy silhouette that seemed to dissolve into the darkness of the forest. She grabbed Liam's hand and hurried him inside, her pulse racing, but when she looked out the window again, the figure was gone. That night, Emily lay awake, trying to shake the memory of the shadowy figure. She told herself it was just a trick of the light, a deer or a stray dog, but the explanation felt hollow. The tug in her chest, faint but undeniable, had returned, and she felt the houses pull again, as if it were calling her back. She tossed and turned, her thoughts spiraling, until exhaustion finally claimed her. When she woke, the first light of dawn was creeping through her window, and she felt a sense of dread she couldn't explain. The house was gone, but the darkness seemed to have left something behind, something that was still clinging to her. Karen noticed Emily's unease at breakfast, the way she picked at her food and avoided eye contact. "Are you okay, sweetheart?" she asked, her voice gentle but laced with concern. Emily nodded, forcing a smile, but Karen could see the fear in her eyes. She exchanged a worried glance with David, who had been unusually quiet since they'd returned from the ruins. They had thought the nightmare was over, but now, as they watched Emily push her plate away, they couldn't shake the feeling that something was still wrong. The shadow of Blackwood Manor, it seemed, was not so easily banished. Later that day, Emily was walking home from school when she felt it again, the cold, creeping sensation of being watched. She quickened her pace, her heart pounding, and didn't dare look back. When she got home, she locked the door behind her and went straight to her room, her hands trembling as she pulled out her journal. She began to write, pouring her fears onto the page, as if putting them into words might help her make sense of them. But the tug in her chest only grew stronger, and she felt the darkness closing in around her, whispering in the back of her mind. That night, Emily dreamed of the house. She was standing in the ruins, the marionettes surrounding her, their strings tangling around her limbs. The jester's grin was wider than ever, its painted eyes gleaming with malice, and she could feel the darkness pulling her in, suffocating her. She woke up gasping for air, her sheets tangled around her, and the room was filled with an unnatural silence. The faint glow of the moonlight through her window seemed to cast strange shadows on the walls, and she felt the tug in her chest again, faint but unmistakable. The next morning, Emily found a marionette, a small, wooden soldier sitting on her windowsill. She stared at it in horror, her hands trembling as she reached out to pick it up. The wood was cold to the touch, the painted face unnervingly lifelike, and she felt a surge of panic. She threw it out the window, shattering it on the ground below, but the head rolled toward the house, its eyes seeming to follow her. She slammed the window shut, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps, and ran to find her parents. Karen and David tried to reassure her, but the fear in their eyes was unmistakable. They searched the house again, checking every room and corner, but there was no sign of the marionettes. The family sat together in the living room, the tension palpable, and Emily felt the tug in her chest again, faint but undeniable. The house wasn't gone, it was calling to her, pulling her back. The marionettes were gone, but the darkness remained, and it had chosen her. The strings were still attached, pulling her into the shadows, and she knew there was no escape. The nightmare had only just begun. The days passed in a blur, the unease growing with each passing hour. Emily found herself jumping at every shadow, her senses on high alert, and the nightmares became more frequent. The marionettes appeared in her dreams, their movements jerky and unnatural, and she could feel the darkness closing in around her. She tried to ignore it, focusing on school and spending time with her friends, but the fear was always there, lurking in the back of her mind. The tug in her chest grew stronger, and she realized she couldn't fight it any longer. One evening, Emily found herself standing in the backyard, the cool air biting at her skin. She didn't remember how she got there, but the marks on her arms were glowing faintly, the lines pulsing with a soft, eerie light. She could feel the house calling to her, the darkness pulling her in, and she knew she had to face it. She walked to the edge of the property, the forest stretching out before her, and she felt a surge of determination. The house had chosen her, but she would choose her family, no matter the cost. Karen and David found Emily in the backyard, her eyes fixed on the forest, and they knew something was wrong. The marks on her arms were glowing brighter than ever, and she seemed almost unaware of their presence. Karen grabbed her shoulders, shaking her gently, but Emily didn't respond. The tug in her chest was overwhelming, and she felt the darkness calling to her, pulling her in. David grabbed his phone and called for help, his voice shaking with panic, but they knew they couldn't wait. The family returned to the ruins of Blackwood Manor, the forest closing in around them as they drove. The air was thick with the scent of decay, and the trees seemed to whisper as they passed. The marks on Emily's arms were glowing brightly, and she could feel the darkness pulling her in, the tug in her chest unbearable. They arrived at the ruins, the once grand structure now a pile of ash and debris, and Emily felt a surge of energy. The house was still here, buried beneath the earth, waiting for her to return. Emily knelt down in the center of the ruins, her hands pressing against the ground, and she felt the darkness surging around her. The marks on her arms glowed brightly, the lines pulsing with energy, and she focused on the feeling, trying to push the darkness away. Karen and David watched in horror, the air around them growing colder, and they knew they had to act. David grabbed the shovel, digging into the ground with all his strength, while Karen held Emily's hand, whispering words of encouragement. David uncovered the wooden box, the same one they had found before, and the air around them grew colder. The box was filled with marionettes, their painted faces twisted into grotesque expressions, and Emily felt the tug in her chest intensify. Karen poured holy water on the box, the marionettes hissing and jerking violently, while David smashed them with the shovel. The ground shook, the air filled with a deafening roar, and the marks on Emily's arms glowed brightly. She felt a surge of energy, as if the house was draining her life force, and she fought against it, her determination unwavering. Karen lit a match, the flames consuming the box and the marionettes, and the ground stopped shaking. The air grew still, the darkness finally defeated, and the marks on Emily's arms faded. She collapsed to the ground, her body trembling, and Karen held her tightly, whispering words of comfort. The house was gone, the darkness destroyed, and the family was together. They sat in silence, the weight of their ordeal lifting, and for the first time in weeks, they felt at peace. The nightmare was over, and they would face the future together, stronger than ever. The winter months settled over the Miller household like a heavy blanket, the air crisp and the days short. The family had found a fragile peace, their routines slowly returning to normal, but the memory of Blackwood Manor lingered like a ghost in the corners of their minds. Emily had thrown herself into her studies, determined to focus on the future, but every now and then, she would catch herself staring out the window, her thoughts drifting back to the ruins. Karen and David watched her carefully, their concern evident in the way they exchanged glances and spoke in hushed tones when they thought she wasn't listening. Liam, too, seemed to sense the lingering unease, often clinging to Emily or Karen when the house grew quiet. One evening, as the family sat together in the living room, a storm rolled in, the wind howling against the windows and the rain lashing against the roof. The power flickered, plunging the room into darkness, and Emily felt a surge of panic. She reached for the flashlight Karen had placed on the coffee table, her hands trembling as she switched it on. The beam of light cut through the darkness, but it did little to calm her nerves. The storm outside seemed to mirror the storm inside her, the memories of Blackwood Manor resurfacing with a vengeance. She tried to focus on the present, on the sound of Karen's voice as she lit a few candles, but the feeling of dread was impossible to ignore. The next morning, the storm had passed, leaving behind a world glistening with ice and snow. Emily bundled up and stepped outside, the cold air biting at her cheeks as she walked to the mailbox. The neighborhood was quiet, the only sound the crunch of her boots on the icy ground. As she opened the mailbox, she noticed something strange, a small, wooden object nestled among the letters. Her heart skipped a beat as she pulled it out, her fingers brushing against the cold, smooth surface. It was a marionette, tiny but unmistakable, its painted eyes staring up at her with a malevolent gleam. She dropped it onto the ground, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps, and ran back inside. Karen and David found Emily in the kitchen, her face pale and her hands trembling as she tried to explain what she had seen. They exchanged a worried glance, the fear in their eyes unmistakable, and went outside to investigate. The marionette was gone, the icy ground marred only by a single set of footprints. David knelt down, examining the footprints carefully, but they seemed to lead nowhere, disappearing into the snow. Karen wrapped an arm around Emily, her voice soothing as she tried to reassure her, but the unease in the air was palpable. The house seemed to hold its breath, the shadows in the corners deepening as the family retreated inside. That night, Emily's nightmares returned with a vengeance. She was back in the ruins of Blackwood Manor, the marionettes surrounding her, their strings tangling around her limbs. The jester's grin was wider than ever, its painted eyes gleaming with malice, and she could feel the darkness pulling her in, suffocating her. She woke up gasping for air, her sheets tangled around her, and the room was filled with an unnatural silence. The faint glow of the moonlight through her window seemed to cast strange shadows on the walls, and she felt the tug in her chest again, faint but unmistakable. She pulled the blankets tighter around her, trying to ignore the feeling, but the fear was impossible to shake. The next morning, Emily found another marionette, this one a small, wooden ballerina sitting on her windowsill. She stared at it in horror, her hands trembling as she reached out to pick it up. The wood was cold to the touch, the painted face unervingly lifelike, and she felt a surge of panic. She threw it out the window, shattering it on the ground below, but the head rolled toward the house, its eyes seeming to follow her. She slammed the window shut, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps, and ran to find her parents. Karen and David tried to reassure her, but the fear in their eyes was unmistakable. They searched the house again, checking every room and corner, but there was no sign of the marionettes. The family sat together in the living room, the tension palpable, and Emily felt the tug in her chest again, faint but undeniable. The house wasn't gone, it was calling to her, pulling her back. The days passed in a blur, the unease growing with each passing hour. Emily found herself jumping at every shadow, her senses on high alert, and the nightmares became more frequent. The marionettes appeared in her dreams, their movements jerky and unnatural, and she could feel the darkness closing in around her. She tried to ignore it, focusing on school and spending time with her friends, but the fear was always there, lurking in the back of her mind. The tug in her chest grew stronger, and she realized she couldn't fight it any longer. One evening, Emily found herself standing in the backyard, the cool air biting at her skin. She didn't remember how she got there, but the marks on her arms were glowing faintly, the lines pulsing with a soft, eerie light. She could feel the house calling to her, the darkness pulling her in, and she knew she had to face it. She walked to the edge of the property, the forest stretching out before her, and she felt a surge of determination. The house had chosen her, but she would choose her family, no matter the cost. Karen and David found Emily in the backyard, her eyes fixed on the forest, and they knew something was wrong. The marks on her arms were glowing brighter than ever, and she seemed almost unaware of their presence. Karen grabbed her shoulders, shaking her gently, but Emily didn't respond. The tug in her chest was overwhelming, and she felt the darkness calling to her, pulling her in. David grabbed his phone and called for help, his voice shaking with panic, but they knew they couldn't wait. The family returned to the ruins of Blackwood Manor, the forest closing in around them as they drove. The air was thick with the scent of decay, and the trees seemed to whisper as they passed. The marks on Emily's arms were glowing brightly, and she could feel the darkness pulling her in, the tug in her chest unbearable. They arrived at the ruins, the once grand structure now a pile of ash and debris, and Emily felt a surge of energy. The house was still here, buried beneath the earth, waiting for her to return. Emily knelt down in the center of the ruins, her hands pressing against the ground, and she felt the darkness surging around her. The marks on her arms glowed brightly, the lines pulsing with energy, and she focused on the feeling, trying to push the darkness away. Karen and David watched in horror, the air around them growing colder, and they knew they had to act. David grabbed the shovel, digging into the ground with all his strength, while Karen held Emily's hand, whispering words of encouragement. David uncovered the wooden box, the same one they had found before, and the air around them grew colder. The box was filled with marionettes, their painted faces twisted into grotesque expressions, and Emily felt the tug in her chest intensify. Karen poured holy water on the box, the marionettes hissing and jerking violently, while David smashed them with the shovel. The ground shook, the air filled with a deafening roar, and the marks on Emily's arms glowed brightly. She felt a surge of energy, as if the house was draining her life force, and she fought against it, her determination unwavering. Karen lit a match, the flames consuming the box and the marionettes, and the ground stopped shaking. The air grew still, the darkness finally defeated, and the marks on Emily's arms faded. She collapsed to the ground, her body trembling, and Karen held her tightly, whispering words of comfort. The house was gone, the darkness destroyed, and the family was together. They sat in silence, the weight of their ordeal lifting, and for the first time in weeks, they felt at peace. The nightmare was over, and they would face the future together, stronger than ever.